My husband demanded our $1.5 million mansion, our entire life savings, and his highly lucrative investment portfolio in our divorce settlement. He left me with absolutely nothing but full custody of our 7-year-old twins. My attorney begged me to fight him, warning me that I was making the biggest financial mistake of my life by giving in to his demands. Sitting across the table in the courtroom, my soon-to-be ex-husband flashed a triumphant, arrogant smile, completely convinced he had just ruined my future. He had absolutely no idea that my signature on those papers was the final piece of a trap I had been setting for months. My name is Gwendolyn, 33 years old, and I hunt digital financial criminals for a living. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who thought you were just a naive stepping stone. Sign it, Gwendolyn, and you can keep those 2 little burdens of yours. Bradley tossed his heavy gold pen across the polished mahogany table, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance only a 35-year-old wealth manager could muster. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, casually adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. The settlement agreement lay between us, a thick stack of legal paper that systematically erased my financial existence. According to the documents, Bradley would keep the massive suburban estate we had purchased together in Chicago. He would take the entirety of our joint savings accounts. Most importantly, he demanded 100% sole ownership of his investment portfolio. From the gallery behind us, a loud, deliberate whisper echoed through the quiet courtroom. Finally, we are cutting off the dead weight. That was Patricia, my 62-year-old mother-in-law. She sat there in the second row wearing her tailored designer blazer, clutching a ridiculously expensive handbag, making absolutely sure her voice carried directly to the judge's bench. Patricia had always viewed my middle-class background as a disease that her son had tragically caught. For years, she constantly reminded anyone who would listen that my job in cybersecurity was nothing more than a glorified desk clerk role. She loved to boast about Bradley's financial genius, while dismissing my career as boring computer work. My lawyer, a sharp and fiercely protective woman named Rebecca, slammed her hand over the contract before I could reach for the pen. "Gwendolyn, you cannot do this." She leaned in, her voice an urgent, frantic whisper near my ear. "You are giving up absolutely everything. You worked 80-hour weeks writing complex code to pay for his master's degree. You paid the mortgage on that house for 3 solid years while he built that wealth management firm from scratch. You cannot let him leave you with nothing but Leo and Mia. You have to fight for your equity. He is exploiting you." I looked at Rebecca, then slowly shifted my gaze to Bradley. He was watching me with a smug, victorious grin. He thrived on this power dynamic, completely convinced that my silence was a sign of total submission. For 7 long years, I had quietly managed the household, raised our twins, and endured his family's constant belittling of my career and my intellect. They thought I spent my days resetting passwords for helpless office workers, entirely ignorant of the fact that my actual job involved tracking illicit financial networks for government contractors. I gently pushed Rebecca's restraining hand off the document. "I am not fighting him, Rebecca," I said, my voice perfectly steady and clear. I picked up the gold pen, feeling its heavy weight in my fingers. "I am giving him exactly what he asked for." Bradley chuckled softly, shooting a triumphant, knowing look back at his mother in the gallery. "Good girl," he mocked, leaning forward to watch me sign. "At least you finally learned your place. The tech sector might pay your little salary, but you do not have the stomach for the real financial world. Just take the kids back to your new cramped apartment and let the adults handle the heavy lifting. You were never built for high stakes anyway." I did not flinch. I did not yell. I did not rise to his bait. I simply pressed the pen to the signature line and signed my name in fluid, decisive strokes. I turned the page and signed again. I initialed every single paragraph that handed him sole legal ownership, and more importantly, sole legal responsibility of his entire investment fund. With one final stroke, I pushed the signed documents back across the table toward his waiting attorney. The judge, a stern-looking man who had remained silent during our tense exchange, collected the paperwork. He reviewed the signatures, stamped the final decree with a heavy thud, and struck his gavel loudly against the sounding block. "The marriage is officially dissolved," the judge announced. "Assets will be divided exactly as stipulated in the signed agreement. Court is adjourned." Court. A collective sigh of relief and satisfaction came from Patricia in the gallery. Bradley stood up rapidly, buttoning his suit jacket, radiating the arrogant energy of a man who believed he had just committed the perfect robbery. He snapped his briefcase shut and looked down at me. "You should have hired a better lawyer, Gwen." He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You really walked away with nothing. You gave up the house, the money, the investments. I hope you enjoy starting over from zero." Right at that exact second, my phone buzzed sharply in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the locked screen. An encrypted alert from my secure server flashed brightly against the dark background. "Legal ownership transferred. Security protocols disengaged. Target isolated." A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my dress, feeling a sudden rush of absolute clarity and power. I had not lost anything today. I had just handed him a ticking time bomb, and he had eagerly signed his name to it. I picked up my bag and looked Bradley directly in the eyes. The smugness on his face faltered for just a fraction of a second, visibly unsettled by my total lack of despair or anger. "Enjoy the portfolio, Bradley," I said, my voice ringing clearly across the emptying courtroom. "It is all yours now, every single bit of it." I turned and walked down the center aisle, the sound of my heels echoing sharply against the marble floor. I did not look back at Patricia's shocked face. I did not look back at my ex-husband. I just walked out into the bright morning sun, knowing that the real game had not even started yet. My name is Gwendolyn. I am 33 years old and I hunt digital financial criminals for a living. The heavy afternoon sun beat down on the paved driveway of the massive suburban estate as I hoisted the final cardboard box into the trunk of my 10-year-old sedan. Leo and Mia were already strapped into the back seat, quietly playing with their tablets. They were too young to fully grasp why we were abruptly leaving the only luxury home they had ever known, but they could easily sense the thick tension in the air. Standing at the top of the grand marble steps, Patricia and Monica observed my departure like prison wardens watching an inmate vacate a cell. Patricia, my former mother-in-law, held a crystal glass of sparkling water. Her sharp gaze swept over my modest car with undisguised disgust. She took a slow, deliberate sip before projecting her voice across the manicured lawn. "Make sure you check those cardboard boxes, Monica," Patricia instructed her daughter, speaking loudly enough for me and the wealthy neighbors to hear. "We cannot have her walking off with the sterling silver or the good china. Lord knows she cannot afford to replace them on a basic IT support salary." Monica laughed loudly, leaning against the massive oak front door. "Oh, please, Mom. Look at her pathetic car. The suspension would collapse if she tried to steal anything heavier than her cheap clothes. Just let her go." Bradley is already having the locks changed anyway. I ignored them entirely, focusing solely on securing the trunk. I had spent 7 long years listening to these women belittle my middle-class background, mock my wardrobe, and constantly degrade my career. They truly believed I was a glorified keyboard repair technician. They had no idea the kind of complex digital architecture I built for the Department of Defense. Let them think I was broken and destitute. It made my next move that much easier. The aggressive roar of a high-performance engine suddenly interrupted the quiet suburban street. A brand-new custom black Porsche Panamera turned into the driveway, its tires crunching heavily against the pristine gravel. The driver's side door swung open and DeAndre stepped out. Monica's husband adjusted his designer sunglasses, flashing a brilliant, arrogant smile. He looked every bit the successful Silicon Valley tech executive, completely oblivious to the fraudulent reality of his own existence. DeAndre walked over, leaning casually against the hood of his sports car. He looked down at my heavily loaded sedan and shook his head with a display of deeply fake sympathy. "Moving day looks incredibly rough, Gwen," he said, crossing his arms over his expensive cashmere sweater. "You know, you really should not have fought Bradley so hard in the beginning. You could have walked away with a nice little alimony check. But hey, if you are struggling to make rent next month, let me know if you need a loan." My startup just secured a $10 million Series A funding round this morning. I am feeling generous. Patricia clapped her hands together from the porch. $10 million. I always knew you were a genius, DeAndre. Bradley was absolutely right to introduce you to those venture capitalists. I slammed the trunk of my sedan shut. The sharp, heavy metallic thud echoed across the driveway, instantly silencing Patricia mid-celebration. I turned around and walked slowly toward DeAndre. I stopped just inches from his smug face, letting my eyes drop to his expensive shoes before meeting his gaze directly. A $10 million valuation, I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and incredibly clear. That is a fascinating number, DeAndre, especially considering that massive valuation is based entirely on a proprietary cybersecurity algorithm you copied directly from my home desktop. DeAndre stiffened. The confident smile faltered slightly on his lips. I do not know what you are talking about. You are just upset about the divorce, Gwen. You are not making any sense. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear the absolute venom dripping from my words. Do not play dumb with me. You copied that source code from my private hard drive while I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from an emergency cesarean section with the twins. I was fighting a life-threatening infection hooked up to monitors, and you were sitting in my home office downloading my life's work onto a flash drive. You took the foundation of my career and pitched it to Bradley's wealthy friends as your own brilliant invention. DeAndre swallowed hard, glancing nervously toward his wife and mother-in-law on the porch. They were watching us closely, unable to hear the quiet conversation, but clearly sensing the sudden drastic shift in the atmosphere. You are completely delusional. DeAndre scoffed, though a visible bead of sweat had formed at his temple. I built a shield tech from scratch. I wrote every single line of that software. You are just a bitter, broke ex-wife trying to claw at my success. If you ever repeat that pathetic lie again, I will ruin your career and sue you for everything you do not have. I smiled warmly, reaching into my jacket pocket for my car keys. I am not going to sue you, DeAndre. Why on earth would I bother suing someone over a prototype? His brow furrowed in deep confusion. A prototype. I jingled my keys, turning my back on him. You copied an unfinished framework. Enjoy the test version, DeAndre. I really hope your new investors do not expect regular security patches. You are crazy, he shouted after me, his voice pitching higher with sudden desperate panic. You are completely crazy. Good luck living in a slum, Gwen. I opened my car door and slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine. Through the open window, I watched DeAndre hastily pull his phone from his pocket. The screen was flashing wildly. He answered the call, pressing the phone to his ear, his arrogant posture already beginning to crumble into absolute terror. Boss, we have a massive problem. The voice of DeAndre's lead developer screamed through the phone speaker, loud enough for me to hear perfectly over the idling engine of my car. The core system just locked us out. The entire backend is encrypted, and we are completely blind. What do you mean you are locked out? DeAndre yelled, his face draining of all color. Use the master override code. Fix it right now. I cannot. The developer's voice bordered on sheer hysteria. The master license was just revoked from an external server. The system does not belong to us anymore. The IP registry is wiping itself. Boss, we have nothing. We just lost the entire platform. DeAndre slowly lowered the phone, his mouth hanging open in absolute horror. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide with the sudden crushing realization of what I had just done. He was no longer a tech genius with a $10 million company. He was a fraud, holding an empty shell. I put the car in drive, gave Patricia and Monica one final cheerful wave from the window, and drove smoothly down the driveway. I left DeAndre standing paralyzed next to his useless Porsche. It took exactly 1 week for Bradley to throw his massive victory parade. I parked my modest sedan between a gleaming red Ferrari and a black stretch limousine lining the street outside the property. Heavy bass thumped through the pristine brick walls of the suburban mansion I had helped pay for. Bradley called the event his Independence Gala. I called it a hostage situation. I had absolutely zero desire to step foot inside that house of horrors, but Bradley had deliberately locked Leo and Mia's passports and original medical records inside his office safe. He had completely ignored my emails for days. He blocked my lawyer's phone calls. He knew the twins needed those exact records for their new school enrollment on Monday morning, and he wanted to force me to beg for them in person. I pushed past a hired security guard and walked through the grand double doors of the estate. The foyer smelled heavily of expensive cigars and spilled champagne. A dozen of Bradley's wealth management colleagues stood around the custom marble bar, laughing loudly and toasting to my supposed financial demise. I kept my posture perfectly straight, completely ignoring the condescending stares from women dripping in diamonds and men wearing luxury watches that cost more than my entire car. I spotted Bradley almost immediately. He held a crystal tumbler of expensive scotch holding court at the center of the massive living room. When he saw me approaching through the crowd, his eyes lit up with a flash of malicious glee. He raised his glass high, gesturing for his wealthy friends to pay attention to my arrival. "Look who came crawling back to reality," Bradley announced, projecting his voice over the loud music so the entire room could hear him. "I told you all she would not last a single week in that cramped little apartment. Miss the luxury you could never afford on your own, Gwen. Did you come to ask me for a weekly allowance?" The finance executives chuckled right on cue, swirling their expensive drinks. I stopped right in front of him, entirely unfazed by his pathetic and public display of ego. I crossed my arms and stared him down with absolute ice in my veins. "I do not miss a single thing about this house, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the laughter. "Especially not you. I am here for my children's medical records and their passports. Open the safe right now," Bradley scoffed, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "You have no authority here anymore, Gwen. You signed everything away. Remember, you are standing on my imported hardwood floors. You play by my rules now." I leaned in just close enough for his closest friends to hear every single word I said next. "I remember buying the very first piece of furniture for this house. It was a cheap particle board desk from a discount store because you were a broke, unpaid intern, literally crying over your massive student debt. I worked 80-hour weeks writing complex security protocols to put food on your table while you paraded around town pretending to be a big shot. You did not build this luxury, Bradley. You hijacked it." His smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a dark flash of genuine anger. His friends awkwardly looked away, the truth of his financial history clearly striking a nerve. Before Bradley could formulate a vicious comeback, a shrill voice cut through the thick tension of the room. Patricia shoved her way through the crowd, tightly gripping a brimful glass of dark red Cabernet. Monica trailed closely behind her mother, wearing a shimmering white silk designer gown she had undoubtedly put on a high-interest credit card. Patricia locked eyes with me, her face twisting with pure, unadulterated spite. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face at a high-class event," Patricia hissed loudly. She lunged forward, feigning a sudden clumsy trip on the expensive Persian rug. She thrust her arm out violently, aiming the full glass of dark red wine directly at my chest. I had spent 7 long years studying this woman's vindictive and theatrical playbook. I simply took one graceful, anticipated step to the left. Patricia stumbled forward heavily, completely losing her balance as her target disappeared. The entire glass of red wine flew through the air in a massive arc, completely missing my outfit and splashing violently across the front of Monica's pristine white silk dress. Monica let out a deafening, piercing scream that actually caused the string quartet in the corner to stop playing. "My dress," Monica shrieked, clawing frantically at the massive, spreading red stain. "This is a $3,000 vintage gown. You ruined it." Patricia scrambled in absolute panic, frantically grabbing cocktail napkins and dabbing at the ruined silk, while the party guests backed away in stunned shock. Bradley spun around to deal with his screaming sister and panicking mother, completely dropping his guard. I did not waste a single second of the beautiful distraction. I walked straight past the chaotic commotion and slipped silently down the hallway into Bradley's private study. He closed the heavy oak door behind me. Bradley actually thought a military-grade biometric smart safe would keep me out. He completely forgot that I am a senior digital forensics consultant, and I had literally written the back-end security patch for that specific brand of hardware. I pulled out my heavily modified smartphone, bypassed his weak local network firewall, and sent a forced override command directly to the locking mechanism in under 30 seconds. The heavy steel door clicked open with a quiet mechanical thud. I reached inside, grabbed the thick manila envelope containing my children's vital documents, and tucked it securely under my arm. I walked casually back into the main reception area as if I had just taken a stroll. Monica was still crying hysterically on a velvet couch, while Patricia yelled at a hired valet to fetch club soda immediately. Bradley stood near the bar, furiously rubbing his temples as his perfect party devolved into a circus. I approached him from behind and dropped a heavy, thick federal envelope directly onto the marble counter right next to his forgotten drink. He jumped spinning around to glare at me. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice shaking with residual anger and stress. "Consider it a highly overdue housewarming gift," I said with a polite, razor-sharp smile. "Have a wonderful party, Bradley." I turned on my heel and walked straight toward the front door, leaving the heavy bass of the music and the screaming of his sister behind me. Before I even reached the driveway, Bradley ripped open the thick envelope. I heard the sharp, frantic tear of the heavy paper, followed by an absolute dead silence that seemed to swallow the entire room. The blood instantly drained from his face as he stared down at the documents. The official seal of the United States federal government stared back at him. It was a direct, non-negotiable subpoena from the Securities and Exchange Commission demanding an immediate and total audit of his entire fraudulent investment portfolio. The heavy pounding on my apartment door started at exactly 12:14 in the morning. The wood rattled against the frame with an aggressive, frantic rhythm that echoed loudly through the quiet hallways of my modest new complex. I did not jump. I simply set down my cup of tea, checked the digital security monitor linked to the hallway camera, and smiled. It was DeAndre. His usual tailored designer suits and his effortless Silicon Valley swagger were completely gone. He wore a wrinkled dark hoodie, his eyes wide and wild, pacing back and forth in the narrow corridor like a caged animal. He raised his fist to strike the door again, but I pulled the deadbolt back and swung it open before he could make contact. He pushed past me immediately, bringing the sharp smell of stale sweat and sheer panic into my small living room. "Fix it!" DeAndre shouted, pointing a visibly shaking finger directly at my face. "You log into that server right now and you restore our access. We are bleeding thousands of dollars every single hour." I calmly closed the front door and locked it behind him. "Keep your voice down, DeAndre. My children are sleeping in the next room, and unlike the sprawling estate you are used to, these walls are thin. I do not care about your kids right now," he snarled, running both hands over his head in a gesture of pure desperation. "My lead developer is threatening to walk out. The venture capital firm is demanding a technical audit by 8 in the morning because the entire system is paralyzed. You committed federal corporate sabotage, Gwen. I am going to have you arrested." I walked over to the small kitchen island and flipped open my laptop. "You cannot arrest someone for locking the doors to their own house." DeAndre stepped dangerously close, towering over me in the dimly lit room. His manufactured charm had entirely evaporated, replaced by raw malice. "That is not your house. That software belongs to my company. This family took you in when you were nothing. Bradley gave you a lifestyle you never could have achieved on your own. And this is how you repay us. I will ruin your pathetic little IT career. I will bury you in so many legal fees you will never see the light of day again." I typed my decryption password into the terminal, the soft click of the keys serving as the only sound in the room for a few tense seconds. "You built a $10 million valuation based entirely on a foundational algorithm you found on my home desktop." I stated the fact clearly, never raising my voice. "You waited until I was hospitalized, recovering from an emergency cesarean section with the twins. I was hooked up to medical monitors fighting a severe infection, and you were sitting comfortably in my home office copying my life's work onto a flash drive. You took the foundation of my career and pitched it to Bradley's wealthy friends as your own brilliant invention. It is my intellectual property." DeAndre spat back, leaning his heavy frame over the kitchen island. We marketed it under A-Shield Tech. It is officially registered. It is federally trademarked. You have absolutely zero legal claim to it, Gwen. You are just a bitter, broke ex-wife trying to steal my glory. A-Shield Tech. I repeated the name slowly, tasting the delicious irony of his ignorance. Did you ever bother to check who actually owns the A-Shield trademark, DeAndre? Or did you just assume that because I was a woman working from home, I had not bothered to secure my assets? I turned the laptop screen toward him. I had the state registry of limited liability companies pulled up right alongside the federal trademark documentation. The registered owner of A-Shield Tech was not DeAndre. It was not his venture capital firm. It was me, Gwendolyn. The registration date clearly showed the company had been established 5 entire years ago. I set up the corporate entity the exact moment I noticed the first irregularities in Bradley's financial accounts. I explained, watching DeAndre's eyes dart frantically across the dense legal text on the screen. You did not steal a free algorithm. You illegally commercialized software owned by an established corporate entity. Technically, DeAndre, your startup is just an unauthorized vendor. Revoking the master license tonight was simply me enforcing my terms of service. You have no product. You have no company. You are a complete fraud. The blood drained entirely from DeAndre's face. His chest heaved as he stared blankly at the screen. The reality of his financial destruction was finally settling in, but his massive ego refused to let him surrender. He slammed his hands down hard on the island, leaning violently over my laptop, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. You are going to transfer that ownership to me right now, he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, threatening register. You are going to sign it over, or I swear to God, Gwen, I will make you deeply regret ever crossing me. You have no idea the kind of people I am dealing with. He took another aggressive step forward, invading my personal space, trying to force me to step back in fear. I did not retreat a single inch. I stood my ground, looked up into his desperate, furious eyes, and pressed a single key on my laptop keyboard. The crisp, unmistakable sound of a recorded conversation instantly filled the kitchen. It was Bradley's voice. We need to move another 300,000 by Friday, DeAndre. The SEC is sniffing around my primary accounts, and I need this capital shifted into your startup as a completely clean vendor payment. Then, DeAndre's voice echoed out from the laptop speakers, sounding relaxed and cocky. No problem, Brad. I will generate a fake invoice for server maintenance and software development. Just wire the cash through the offshore account like last time, clean as a whistle. I tapped the spacebar, pausing the playback. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. DeAndre completely stopped breathing. His hands began to shake violently against the countertop. The threat of physical violence instantly dissolved, replaced by the sheer, paralyzing terror of impending federal prison time. I have monitored every single device connected to that mansion's network for 3 years, I said quietly, letting the massive weight of my words crush whatever foolish defiance he had left. I have gigabytes of recorded audio, deleted wire transfers, and encrypted chat logs proving that your brilliant $10 million startup is nothing more than a glorified laundromat for Bradley's stolen investment funds. DeAndre opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His knees literally buckled under his own weight. He grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter, slowly sliding down the cabinets until he hit the cheap linoleum floor. He dropped entirely to his knees, staring up at me with hollow, terrified eyes. The arrogant tech CEO had been completely erased. Do you still want to sue me for corporate sabotage, DeAndre? I asked, looking down at the man who had relentlessly mocked me just hours earlier in the driveway. Or do you want me to forward this audio file directly to the FBI field office? DeAndre scrambled off my kitchen floor like a beaten dog, stumbling out of my apartment without uttering another word. I locked the door, finished my tea, and slept better than I had in a decade. 12 hours later, the real architect of my former misery decided to make his grand entrance. I was sitting at my glass desk in the secure restricted access wing of my actual office building in downtown Chicago. The panoramic windows overlooked the city skyline, a far cry from the dingy basement cubicle my former family assumed I occupied. I was reviewing the encrypted logs from DeAndre's frozen servers when the heavy reinforced glass doors of our suite were practically thrown off their hinges. Bradley marched into the high-security sector, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He was flanked by a tall, shark-eyed man in a bespoke pinstripe suit, clutching a thick leather briefcase. Bradley had clearly used his aggressive corporate lawyer to bully his way past the lobby security guards, desperate to resolve the crisis I had initiated the night before. Bradley slammed his hands down on my desk, leaning over me with the exact same physical intimidation tactics his brother-in-law had tried. "Give me the master code right now, Gwen," Bradley barked, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. DeAndre is having a total nervous breakdown. His entire platform is locked down and my capital is trapped inside that system. Unlock the servers immediately, or my attorney here is going to bury you so deep in corporate sabotage lawsuits you will never see daylight again. The lawyer stepped forward, pulling a stack of legal documents from his briefcase and slapping them onto my desk. "You are in violation of intellectual property laws, Ms. Thorne," the lawyer stated smoothly, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "You have unlawfully restricted access to A-Shield Tech servers. Restore the access, or we will file for emergency injunctions and criminal damages within the hour." I did not look at the documents. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and picked up my pen. "I am the sole registered owner of A-Shield Tech," I replied calmly. DeAndre stole my proprietary architecture. I simply revoked a license from a vendor who violated my terms of service. You cannot sue me for locking my own digital doors. Bradley let out a sharp, nasty laugh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You think you are so smart, Gwen? You think playing these little hacker games gives you leverage. It does not. I want that code. If you do not type it into your computer right this second, I am calling my family court judge." He pointed a finger directly at my face, a vein bulging in his neck. "I will file for full immediate custody of Leo and Mia today. I will tell the judge your cramped little apartment is entirely unfit for my children. I will tell them you are mentally unstable and lashing out because of the divorce. You are a broke IT desk worker, making pennies repairing keyboards. A judge will look at my mansion, look at my bank accounts, and hand the kids to me in a heartbeat. Give DeAndre the code or say goodbye to the twins forever." The threat hung heavy in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the office. Bradley smirked, completely convinced he had just played his winning card. He expected me to crumble, to cry, to beg for my children, just to keep them in my life. Instead, the frosted glass door behind my desk slid open with a soft, mechanical hiss. Director Vance stepped out of his office. He was a massive, imposing man, with graying hair and the unmistakable rigid posture of a lifelong military commander. He held a classified tablet under one arm and fixed Bradley with a stare cold enough to freeze water. "Is there a problem out here, Gwendolyn?" Director Vance asked, his deep voice carrying absolute, unquestionable authority. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. "No problem at all, Director." I gestured toward my ex-husband. "Bradley, I would like you to meet Director Vance from the United States Department of Defense. I do not fix keyboards. I am a senior cybersecurity consultant for the federal government. My salary is significantly higher than your artificially inflated wealth management income. You will never take my children." Bradley blinked, taking a slow step back. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, jarring confusion. He looked at Director Vance, then back at the panoramic windows, finally processing the reality of the high-tech, restricted government facility he had just stormed into. "I do not care who your boss is," Bradley stammered, though his voice had entirely lost its aggressive edge. "You are legally obligated to release those servers. We have contracts. We have capital tied up in that infrastructure." I ignored Bradley entirely and turned my attention to his shark-eyed corporate lawyer. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I slid it deliberately across the glass desk, stopping it right in front of the attorney. "I suggest you review your client's financial stability before you start billing him for billable hours," I advised the lawyer, tapping the top of the folder. The attorney frowned cautiously, picking up the dossier. He flipped it open. Bradley demanded sole absolute ownership of his massive investment portfolio in our divorce settlement. I explained, my voice ringing clear and steady across the room. He forced me to sign away all my marital rights to that fund, completely convinced he was leaving me destitute. But by taking 100% of the portfolio in the divorce, he took 100% of its legal liabilities. Bradley scoffed loudly, crossing his arms. My portfolio is bulletproof. You are bluffing. I never bluff, Bradley. I kept my eyes locked on the lawyer, whose face was rapidly losing color as he scanned the top page of the dossier. 80% of your precious investment fund is an illegal Ponzi scheme. I spent the last 3 years tracking your offshore wire transfers, your fake vendor invoices, and your laundered shell companies disguised as tech startups. My signature on those divorce papers was not a surrender. It was the only thing legally separating me from your federal crimes. The corporate lawyer stopped reading. He looked up, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated professional terror. He looked at the federal seal on the forensic accounting report, looked at Director Vance standing imposing in the doorway, and then slowly looked at Bradley. The attorney abruptly dropped the manila folder back onto my desk. He let go of his leather briefcase, letting it hit the carpeted floor with a heavy thud, and physically took 3 large steps backward, putting a massive amount of distance between himself and Bradley. I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel, the lawyer stated, his voice trembling slightly. Do not ever contact my firm again. The crisp Tuesday afternoon air carried the sound of laughing children as I stood outside the heavy iron gates of Oak Ridge Elementary School. Leo and Mia were due to be released in exactly 5 minutes. I checked my phone, casually scrolling through the final confirmation emails from Director Vance. Bradley's entire financial world was officially locked down under federal investigation. I took a deep, refreshing breath of the autumn air, finally feeling a genuine sense of peace. That peace was instantly shattered by the screeching of tires. A silver luxury SUV hopped the curb, stopping diagonally across 2 reserved parking spaces. The driver's side door flew open, hitting a nearby trash can with a loud metallic clang. Patricia stormed out onto the sidewalk. She was a terrifying sight. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was frantic and windblown. She wore a wrinkled cashmere coat draped unevenly over her shoulders, and her designer sunglasses were slightly crooked on her face. "Gwendolyn!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking like a whip across the quiet schoolyard. Dozens of wealthy parents standing nearby immediately stopped their polite chatter. Heads turned, eyes widened. Patricia marched directly toward me, her heels stomping aggressively on the pavement. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, her face twisted in a mask of absolute fury and desperation. "You malicious, ungrateful little snake!" she screamed, completely abandoning her high society persona. "Do you have any idea what you have done? My platinum cards were declined at the country club this morning. The bank froze my primary checking account. Bradley is sitting in a lawyer's office practically crying because federal agents are tearing apart his firm. You orchestrated this entire witch hunt to ruin us." I stood perfectly still, keeping my hands resting loosely in the pockets of my trench coat. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply let her audience of shocked suburban parents take in every single pathetic word. "Bradley ruined himself, Patricia." I replied, my voice carrying clearly over the murmurs of the crowd. "He built a fraudulent empire on stolen money." I simply stepped out of the blast radius before the bomb detonated. Patricia gasped loudly, pressing a hand to her chest as if I had physically struck her. She looked around at the gathering crowd of mothers and fathers, immediately shifting into her favorite role as the tragic, deeply wronged victim. "Listen to her," Patricia cried out to the staring parents. "Listen to how she speaks to her own family. We gave this girl everything. I welcomed her into my home. I let you sit at my formal dining table when you were nothing but middle-class trash, Gwen. You had absolutely nothing before my son picked you up out of obscurity. We elevated you, and you repaid my kindness by framing my innocent boy." The sheer audacity of her delusion was almost impressive. For years I had bitten my tongue to keep the peace. I had smiled politely while she insulted my clothes, my upbringing, and my career. But I was no longer the quiet, accommodating wife she could verbally abuse without consequence. "You never elevated me, Patricia," I said, taking one deliberate step toward her. The freezing temperature of my voice caused her to instinctively step back. You barely tolerated me because my income paid the mortgage on that mansion, while Bradley was desperately trying to fake his way to the top. Do not dare stand here and lecture me about kindness. I remember exactly how you treated my family. You fed my kids expired food from the back of your pantry while you were out buying yourself Prada handbags with money that did not even belong to you. Patricia's face turned a violent shade of red. How dare you accuse me of such vulgar things? She sputtered, her hands shaking wildly. I am accusing you of living on stolen time, I shot back, raising my voice just enough to ensure the parents in the back row heard every syllable. You are completely broke because your son stole from his clients to fund your lifestyle. Those designer shoes, the country club memberships, the luxury cars, every single piece of your fake reality was bought with laundered money. The game is entirely over. The surrounding parents began whispering frantically to one another. A few subtly pulled out their phones, clearly recording the explosive confrontation. Patricia noticed the shifting dynamic. She saw the wealthy elite of her neighborhood looking at her not with sympathy, but with profound disgust and suspicion. Her ego simply could not handle the public humiliation. The mask completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but pure, reckless arrogance. You think you have won because you froze a few bank accounts, Patricia shrieked, leaning forward until I could smell the stale wine on her breath. You are nothing but a pathetic desk worker playing out of your league. You think Bradley and I are stupid enough to leave everything in the hands of the banks. I have enough hard cash locked inside my personal safe at home to destroy you in court. I will bury you so deep in litigation you will never see Leo and Mia again. You will be penniless and alone, Gwen. She stood panting, a triumphant sneer slowly crawling back onto her face as she waited for me to crumble under the weight of her threat. She firmly believed that throwing her hidden wealth in my face would finally put me back in my place. I did not break down. I did not panic. A slow, genuinely warm smile spread across my face. I looked past Patricia's shoulder toward the street behind her. That is incredibly helpful information, Patricia, I said softly. I raised my right hand and offered a polite, cheerful wave toward a heavily tinted black SUV parked directly across the street from the school entrance. The vehicle had been sitting there, idling quietly for the past 20 minutes. Patricia frowned, turning her head to follow my gaze. The heavy doors of the SUV swung open simultaneously. Two men stepped out onto the pavement. They wore dark, nondescript suits and carried official federal badges clipped securely to their belts. They walked with deliberate, synchronized purpose, straight across the street, cutting directly through the crowd of staring parents. Patricia, I would love for you to meet Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Davis, I said, gesturing toward the approaching men. They are lead investigators for the Internal Revenue Service. Patricia froze completely. The arrogant sneer vanished from her face, replaced by a look of sheer, suffocating terror. They have been monitoring Bradley's immediate family all morning, I continued, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. And they just recorded your very loud, very public admission of harboring massive amounts of undeclared cash in a hidden personal safe. Enjoy the audit. The morning after Patricia's spectacular public self-destruction, I decided to treat myself to an overpriced latte at the Artisan Roastery, a block from my office building. I was standing at the condiment station, securing the lid on my cup, when a heavy hand grabbed my elbow. I spun around, my free hand instinctively reaching for the pepper spray in my pocket, but stopped immediately when I saw the face. It was DeAndre. If Patricia had looked like a frantic mess the day before, DeAndre looked like a walking corpse. He was wearing the exact same dark hoodie he had worn to my apartment 2 nights ago. He smelled of stale coffee, cold sweat, and sheer panic. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the crowded cafe, as if he expected federal agents to drop from the ceiling ventilation at any given second. I need 5 minutes, Gwen. Please. He gasped, his voice a ragged, desperate whisper. Just 5 minutes. You owe me that much. I owe you absolutely nothing, DeAndre. I replied, my voice perfectly level. I stepped back, forcing him to release my arm. But I have 10 minutes before my morning briefing. Sit down. We moved to a small secluded table in the back corner of the shop. DeAndre collapsed into his chair, immediately leaning forward and burying his face in his hands. The arrogant, untouchable Silicon Valley tech executive had been completely eradicated. The venture capital firm executed the technical audit yesterday morning, DeAndre stammered, staring blindly at the scarred wooden table. When my lead developer could not bypass your master lock, they pulled our funding. Every single dime. They are filing investor fraud charges with the SEC by the end of the week because they realized I do not actually own the proprietary algorithm I sold them. That is the standard penalty for intellectual property theft. I stated, taking a slow sip of my latte. You stole a federally trademarked architecture. You should be contacting a criminal defense attorney right now, not your ex-sister-in-law. DeAndre looked up, his eyes glassy and wild. It is not just the business, Gwen. It is Monica. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. She is packing her bags. She found out the black cards were declining. When I told her the startup funds were frozen and Bradley was under federal investigation, she completely lost it. She told me she did not sign up to be married to a bankrupt fraud. She is threatening to leave me, Gwen. I'm losing my marriage because the money ran out. I set my coffee cup down on the table with a sharp, definitive click. I leaned across the small table, closing the distance between us, ensuring my voice sliced directly through his pathetic attempt at generating sympathy. You want me to feel sorry for Monica? I asked, keeping my tone ice cold and razor sharp. The exact same Monica who stood in my kitchen last Thanksgiving, sipping my expensive wine, while the two of you laughed until you cried over my clothes. You stood there in your tailored designer suits and openly mocked the thrift store sweater I was wearing. You called me a pathetic charity case. You told me I should be eternally grateful that a man of Bradley's stature allowed middle-class trash to sit at his dining table. Do you remember that, DeAndre? DeAndre flinched, shrinking back into his chair. He opened his mouth to formulate an apology, but the words died in his throat. He knew exactly what they had done. I do not care about your marriage, I continued relentlessly. I do not care if Monica leaves you for a wealthier Mark, but I am a businesswoman, DeAndre, and right now you are holding a depreciating asset that I find highly valuable. DeAndre's head snapped up. A tiny, pathetic spark of hope ignited in his bloodshot eyes. What do you want? I will do anything, Gwen, I swear to God. Just tell me what you want. I'm going to offer you a lifeline, I said, folding my hands neatly on the table. I will grant your shell company a limited, non-exclusive, heavily monitored license to my A-Shield Tech software. It will be legally binding and backdated. It will give you just enough operational access to show your venture capital investors a functioning product. It turns your federal wire fraud crisis into a simple corporate licensing dispute. You avoid federal prison for defrauding your investors, and you keep whatever miserable scraps of funding the VC firm lets you walk away with. DeAndre stared at me, his mouth hanging slightly open. He was practically vibrating with desperate relief. You would do that? You would give me a license? There is a price, I stated, shutting down his momentary elation. And it is entirely non-negotiable. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I slid it across the table. It was a blank legal affidavit. You are going to sign a sworn, legally binding federal affidavit. I instructed, my eyes locked dead onto his. You are going to detail every single illegal wire transfer, every fabricated vendor invoice, and every offshore account Bradley utilized to launder his stolen investment capital through your startup. You will testify that he orchestrated the entire scheme. You hand the authorities his head on a silver platter, completely securing his conviction. DeAndre stared at the blank paper as if it were a loaded weapon. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. Gwen, he is my brother-in-law. He is Monica's brother. If I sign this, I am sending him to federal prison for decades. He will be completely destroyed. He is already destroyed, I corrected him sharply. The only question left is whether you are going to let him drag you down to the bottom of the ocean with him. Bradley used you as a disposable shield. He set you up to take the fall if the SEC ever audited his primary accounts. You owe him absolutely zero loyalty. Sign the paper, DeAndre. Save yourself. Save whatever is left of your miserable marriage. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. The ambient noise of the coffee shop faded into the background. DeAndre looked at the paper, then looked at me. The last remnants of his family loyalty evaporated, replaced entirely by raw, primal self-preservation. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a heavy silver pen, and clicked it open. "I will do it." DeAndre whispered, his voice shaking as he brought the pen down to the paper. "I will sign whatever you want. I will give them everything they need on Bradley. Just give me the software license." He began to write his full legal name at the top of the affidavit. Neither of us heard the sharp click of designer heels approaching our table. Neither of us noticed the shadow falling across the wooden surface until a heavy leather Prada handbag hit the coffee shop floor with a deafening thud. DeAndre froze. He slowly turned his head, the blood draining instantly from his face. Monica was standing exactly 3 feet behind him. Her face was an absolute mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She had heard every single word. She had just stood there and listened to her husband sell her beloved brother to the federal government just to save his own skin. The heavy leather Prada handbag hit the coffee shop floor with a deafening final thud. The sudden noise echoed sharply through the quiet space, instantly drawing the eyes of every patron and barista in the room. Monica stood frozen exactly 3 feet behind DeAndre. Her perfect, meticulously crafted country club posture was impossibly rigid. Her face was entirely drained of color, twisted into an expression of absolute, unadulterated horror. She had heard everything. She had stood there in the shadows and listened as her husband casually traded her beloved brother to the federal government in exchange for his own freedom. DeAndre went completely stiff. The heavy silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly onto the table and rolling over the freshly signed affidavit. He slowly turned his head, his bloodshot eyes widening in sheer, unvarnished panic as he met his wife's furious gaze. "Monica, baby, please," DeAndre stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic, desperate gesture of surrender. "You have to understand the position I was in. They cornered me." Monica did not look at him. Her eyes snapped away from her cowardly husband and locked onto me with a level of hatred that was almost tangible. The shock radiating from her body instantly transformed into a blind, reckless rage. All of her high society grooming evaporated in a single second. She lunged forward, grabbing DeAndre's freshly poured steaming Americano from the edge of our table. With a guttural shriek, she hurled the scalding liquid directly at my face. My reflexes kicked in instantly. I snatched the heavy laminated dessert menu from the center of the table and fanned it out in front of me like a riot shield. The dark boiling coffee splattered violently against the thick plastic surface, dripping harmlessly down the menu and pooling into a dark, steaming puddle onto the hardwood floor. "You are tearing my family apart!" Monica screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and echoing off the exposed brick walls of the cafe. Patrons scrambled out of their seats, grabbing their belongings and moving rapidly away from the unfolding disaster. The barista behind the counter froze, holding a steaming pitcher of milk in midair. Monica stepped closer, her chest heaving, pointing a manicured, trembling finger aggressively at my chest. "You never fit in," she yelled, her voice breaking with venomous spite. "You were always the ugly duckling sitting in the corner, secretly jealous of our money. You hated us from the very beginning. You wanted the cars, the houses, the prestige, and now you are trying to destroy us because you could never truly be one of us." I slowly lowered the coffee-stained menu and placed it flat on the table, making sure not to smudge the crucial affidavit. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer, rising to my full height. I did not yell. I did not need to raise my voice to command the room. My voice was lethal, precise, and cut through her hysterical screaming with absolute clarity. "Your money was an illusion, Monica," I stated, watching the fierce defiance flicker and waver in her eyes. "You were parading around in designer gowns bought with stolen, laundered funds. Your entire existence, the exclusive country club memberships, the luxury vacations to the Amalfi Coast, the private school tuitions for your children, it was all completely subsidized by your brother's criminal enterprise. You are not royalty. You are the beneficiary of a massive federal crime." Monica opened her mouth to argue, gasping for air, but I took a deliberate step forward, forcing her to step back and retreat. And as for tearing your precious family apart, I suggest you take a hard look at the man cowering in the chair next to you. I continued, relentlessly pointing down at DeAndre. Your husband just traded your brother to the feds to save his own skin. He signed away Bradley's freedom the absolute second his own bank accounts were threatened. Monica whipped her head around to look at DeAndre. He shrank down into his seat, attempting to make himself as small as possible, unable to meet her furious, devastating gaze. He looked utterly pathetic and entirely defeated. I had no choice, Monica. DeAndre pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. The SEC was coming. The venture capital firm pulled all of our funding this morning. If I did not sign that affidavit, I was going to federal prison for investor fraud. Bradley set me up to take the fall. He used my startup as a dumping ground for his dirty cash. I had to protect myself. I had to protect our marriage. Monica stared at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. The realization that her lavish lifestyle was entirely fraudulent, compounded by the immediate cowardly betrayal of her husband, sent her into a frantic panic. She dropped to her knees, digging wildly through her fallen Prada bag. Her hands were shaking so violently, she knocked over her own cosmetics pouch, sending expensive lipsticks and mirrored compacts spilling across the floor. She finally grasped her smartphone, snatching it up and scrambling back to her feet. I am calling Bradley right now. Monica snarled, her fingers tapping erratically against the glass screen. I am going to warn him about what this coward just did. He is going to hire the best defense team in the country. He is going to liquidate his offshore accounts, and he is going to make absolutely certain that you end up with nothing, Gwen. You will pay for what you have done to us. She pressed the phone to her ear, listening eagerly to the dialing tone, a triumphant, desperate smirk crawling onto her face. She firmly believed she still had the power to outsmart me, to utilize her family's endless resources to crush me into the dirt one final time. I simply smiled. It was a cool, deeply detached expression. I glanced down at the sleek smartwatch secured to my wrist, noting the precise hour and minute. I would not bother Monica, I said calmly, letting my hands rest loosely at my sides. Federal agents breached his office exactly 4 minutes ago. Monica scoffed loudly, refusing to lower the phone from her ear. You are bluffing. You are just a bitter desk worker making up lies. Just then, the volume on the coffee shop's overhead television suddenly spiked. The barista, who had been watching the entire confrontation in stunned silence, grabbed the remote and turned up the sound. I gestured silently toward the large flat screen mounted above the pastry display. Monica slowly turned her head. Her phone slipped slightly from her ear as she stared up at the screen. A bright red breaking news graphic flashed across the bottom of the television broadcast. The live helicopter footage showed the gleaming glass exterior of Bradley's corporate headquarters downtown, surrounded by flashing blue and red police lights. The camera zoomed in tightly on the front entrance. The heavy revolving doors were pushed open, and Bradley emerged. He was entirely stripped of his usual arrogant swagger. His expensive custom-tailored suit jacket was crumpled, and his head was bowed in absolute crushing defeat. He was being led out of his own building, his hands secured firmly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. He was flanked on all sides by stern-faced federal agents, wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI stamped across their backs. Monica's phone slipped from her trembling fingers, entirely hitting the floor and shattering the screen into a spiderweb of cracked glass. She stood frozen in the middle of the coffee shop, completely unable to look away from the television, as her untouchable brother was unceremoniously loaded into the back of a black government vehicle. 48 hours after the live helicopter broadcast of his arrest, Bradley managed to slither out of federal holding. He had to drain the absolute last remnants of Patricia's legitimate retirement accounts, to post his staggering bail, leaving his mother with nothing but the clothes in her closet and a looming IRS audit. But Bradley was not using his temporary, highly restricted freedom to prepare a quiet plea deal. True to his family's toxic nature, he was aggressively pivoting to his only remaining strategy. He was going to play the victim. The interrogation room inside the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission field office was windowless, sterile, and freezing. I sat perfectly still in a rigid metal chair, keeping my hands neatly folded in my lap. Directly across the scratched aluminum table sat my ex-husband. He had completely abandoned his usual tailored, arrogant aesthetic. He wore a rumpled beige button-down shirt, his hair unstyled, dark circles deliberately left unmasked under his eyes. Beside him sat a sweating, overwhelmed, court-appointed attorney, the only legal counsel he could secure after his high-powered corporate lawyer abandoned him. Special Agent Miller and lead investigator Reynolds stood near the heavy steel door, their expressions entirely neutral as they watched Bradley perform the greatest theatrical routine of his life. "You have to look at the power dynamic here, agents," Bradley pleaded, leaning forward and clasping his hands together in a display of manufactured agony. "I am just a wealth manager. I evaluate market risk and client portfolios. I do not know the first thing about cryptographic algorithms, server partitioning, or deep web architecture, but Gwendolyn does." He looked directly at the investigators, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. "She is a senior cybersecurity consultant for the Department of Defense," Bradley continued, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "She spent years building our home network. When I started my firm, she insisted on designing the back-end security infrastructure to save us money. I trusted my wife with my entire digital life. But when our marriage started falling apart, when I realized she was unstable and asked for a divorce to protect our twins, she looked me dead in the eye and promised she would burn my world to the ground." Bradley wiped a non-existent tear from his cheek, leaning closer to the microphone resting in the center of the table. "She engineered this entire operation," he stated with chilling conviction. "She used her federal security clearance and her technical genius to manipulate my fund's automated algorithms. She bypassed my security, siphoned the capital, and routed that stolen money directly into DeAndre's startup servers to frame my entire family. I am completely innocent. I am the victim of a vindictive, brilliant hacker who orchestrated a massive financial crime just to secure full custody of our children and destroy my reputation." The silence in the interrogation room was heavy and suffocating. Bradley slouched back into his chair, breathing heavily, looking like a man who had just unburdened his soul. He shot me a fleeting, microscopic smirk. He honestly believed his lie was flawless. He thought he could use my actual professional skills against me, twisting my competence into a criminal weapon to save his own skin. Agent Reynolds slowly turned her gaze toward me. "Ms. Thorne, these are severe, highly specific allegations," she said, her voice betraying absolutely no emotion. "Your ex-husband is claiming you actively manipulated his firm's digital infrastructure to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar money laundering conspiracy. How do you respond?" I did not raise my voice. I did not rush to defend my character against his pathetic, desperate soap opera. I calmly unclasped my hands, reached into the inner pocket of my blazer, and pulled out a small, heavy titanium USB drive. I placed it deliberately in the exact center of the aluminum table. The sharp metallic clink echoed loudly off the bare concrete walls. "I do not deal in domestic disputes, Bradley. I deal in immutable data," I said, keeping my eyes locked on his pale face. I turned my attention to the two federal investigators. "That drive contains a complete, unalterable blockchain audit trail of every single transaction moving through Bradley's firm over the last 4 years. It does not just track IP addresses or server pings. It tracks the hardware terminal IDs and the biometric logins required to execute every transfer." I leaned forward, mirroring Bradley's earlier posture, but radiating absolute ice. "The data on that drive proves indisputably that Bradley initiated every single fraudulent wire transfer himself using his personal encrypted laptop," I explained clearly. "More importantly, the system required his biometric fingerprint on the trackpad to authorize the movement of funds over $10,000. I could not fake his physical fingerprint, nor could I spoof the proprietary hardware ID of a laptop that never left his possession." Bradley scoffed loudly, attempting to maintain his fragile victim persona. "You could have spoofed those logins, Gwen. You are a tech genius. You could have planted that data to cover your tracks. I smiled. It was a cold, ruthless expression that caused the court-appointed lawyer beside him to flinch. I could have. I agreed softly. But I did not need to. Because I did not compile this data yesterday, Bradley. I turned my attention fully to Agent Miller and Agent Reynolds. I reported the initial structural anomalies in Bradley's wealth management accounts to the SEC whistleblower tip line exactly 6 months before our divorce was even filed. I bypassed local authorities and went straight to the federal level because I knew his entire family was compromised. Bradley stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. I have been working as an active confidential informant for the federal government for 3 years. I stated, letting the absolute finality of my words crush the last remaining oxygen out of his lungs. I handed over the decryption keys, the wire logs, and the offshore account routing numbers month by month. By the time I signed those divorce papers handing you the entirety of your poisoned portfolio, the trap was already completely set. I do not need to defend myself against your ridiculous accusations today, Bradley, because I already possess full documented federal immunity. The realization hit Bradley with the force of a freight train. The pathetic, traumatized victim act shattered into a million pieces. The reality of his decades-long prison sentence crashed over him, completely breaking his mind. A guttural, animalistic roar of pure rage tore from his throat. He vaulted violently out of his metal chair, kicking it backwards so hard it slammed into the concrete wall. With his hands curled into fists, he lunged across the narrow aluminum table, aiming directly for my throat. I did not even blink. Before Bradley could clear the center of the table, the 2 federal guards stationed outside the door surged forward. They collided with him in midair, slamming his face brutally into the hard metal surface and instantly pinning his arms behind his back. The heavy impact of Bradley's face against the cold aluminum table echoed like a gunshot through the interrogation room. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply watched as the 2 federal guards drove their knees into his spine, expertly securing his wrists in heavy steel cuffs while he thrashed and screamed obscenities. His manic, terrifying rage was the final confirmation of his absolute defeat. "Thank you for your time, agents," I said, my voice perfectly steady. I picked up my coat and walked out of the freezing, windowless room, leaving the sound of my ex-husband's desperate, animalistic roaring trapped behind the heavy steel door. By the time I stepped out of the federal building and into the crisp afternoon air, the digital guillotine had already dropped. The blockchain audit I provided triggered an immediate automated asset freeze across every single financial institution tied to the Thorn name. There were no loopholes left. There were no hidden offshore accounts left to drain. The entire fraudulent empire had been instantly liquidated. 3 days later, that absolute financial 0 point reached the Thorn family stronghold. The sprawling $1.5 million estate usually sat in pristine, arrogant silence at the end of a private cul-de-sac. Today, the perfectly manicured lawn was completely destroyed. 3 massive, unmarked moving vans were parked haphazardly across the grass, their heavy tires carving deep, muddy trenches into the expensive landscaping. The front doors of the mansion were propped wide open, and the interior was a scene of absolute unhinged chaos. Patricia and Monica were tearing the house apart like looters on a sinking ship. "Careful with that frame, you incompetent fool!" Patricia screeched, her voice echoing shrilly across the grand foyer. She was wearing a silk bathrobe over expensive slacks, her hair wild and unkempt. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at 2 sweaty movers who were struggling to carry a massive ornate oil painting down the sweeping curved staircase. "That artwork has been in the Thorn family for 3 generations!" Patricia yelled frantically, waving them toward the front door. "It belongs to us, not some faceless bank. My husband bought that piece in Paris. Get it into the truck right now before the auditors show up and try to steal what is rightfully mine." Her delusion was absolute. She genuinely believed she was the victim, entirely ignoring the fact that her late husband had purchased the painting using money Bradley had siphoned from his earliest clients. To Patricia, the origin of the wealth did not matter. She only cared that she possessed it. In the formal dining room, Monica was acting with even less restraint. She was violently yanking expensive antique silver cutlery from velvet-lined drawers and dumping them unceremoniously into heavy canvas duffel bags. Her hands shook violently. She looked completely unhinged, her eyes darting around the room as she muttered curses under her breath. She had spent the last 72 hours dealing with the reality of DeAndre turning state's evidence against her brother, and her sanity was completely fracturing under the weight of her impending poverty. "Hurry up, Mom!" Monica snapped aggressively, zipping a duffel bag full of stolen silver. The venture capital firm locked DeAndre out of everything. The accounts are zeroed. If the bank forecloses on this house today, we will have absolutely nothing left. Grab the jewelry boxes from the master suite and let us get out of here. They were so entirely consumed by their frantic, greedy looting that they did not hear the sound of heavy tires crunching onto the gravel driveway. They did not notice the 3 black SUVs pulling up sharply, completely blocking the unmarked moving vans from leaving the property. I stepped out of the lead vehicle. I was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, holding a thick leather-bound clipboard. Flanking me on my right was a senior executive from the primary lending bank holding the Thorn mortgage. Flanking me on my left were 2 uniformed city police officers, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. We walked in perfect unison up the wide brick pathway, our footsteps crunching loudly. Patricia stepped out onto the grand front porch to yell at a mover, but the words died in her throat. She froze, her eyes widening in pure shock as she took in the sight of the police vehicles blocking her escape route. Then her gaze locked onto me. The shock instantly transformed into a blind territorial rage. "Get off my property!" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking as she marched down the top 3 steps, pointing aggressively at my face. "You malicious, vindictive little snake. You have absolutely no right to be here. This is a private residence. You are trespassing. I will have you arrested." Monica rushed out of the front door behind her mother, dropping a duffel bag onto the porch. When she saw the uniformed officers, the remaining color drained entirely from her face. "You destroyed my brother!" Monica yelled, her voice trembling with hysteria. "You destroyed my marriage! Are you not satisfied, Gwen? What more could you possibly want from us?" I did not stop walking until I reached the bottom of the porch steps. I looked up at the 2 women who had spent over a decade making me feel utterly worthless, who had mocked my upbringing, insulted my career, and treated me like disposable trash. They were standing amid the ruins of their fraudulent kingdom, clutching stolen silver and screaming like cornered animals. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply held up the heavy clipboard, turning it so Patricia could see the official bank foreclosure seal stamped across the top document. "I am not trespassing, Patricia," I stated, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet, crisp air. "I was hired by the bank as an independent digital auditor to track and recover all stolen assets tied to Bradley's accounts." Patricia's mouth fell open, her eyes darting frantically from the clipboard to the bank executive and finally to the police officers moving forward to secure the moving vans. "Put the Picasso down, Patricia," I commanded, my voice dropping to a freezing absolute 0. "That belongs to the federal government now." The bank executive stepped forward, flanked by the 2 uniformed officers. He did not say a single word, simply gesturing with his pen toward the open front doors. The movers, realizing they were suddenly standing in the exact center of a federal asset seizure, immediately dropped the heavy gilded frame of the Picasso onto the mahogany porch. They backed away with their hands raised in surrender, leaving the priceless artwork leaning against a stone pillar, and practically sprinted toward their unmarked vans. Patricia stared at the abandoned painting, her mouth opening and closing in silent, frantic disbelief. Monica was slumped against the exterior brickwork, openly sobbing into her hands, as the reality of her sudden poverty crushed her remaining sanity. I stepped past them, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian tile of the grand foyer. The interior of the mansion was a chaotic graveyard of extreme, unearned wealth. Crystal vases were shoved haphazardly into cardboard boxes. Persian rugs were rolled and tied with cheap twine. Patricia rushed in behind me, the heels of her silk slippers slapping wildly against the floor. Her initial shock was rapidly giving way to a calculated, desperate survival instinct. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life avoiding accountability, and her brain was frantically searching for a scapegoat to absorb the impact of the impending destruction. If you are looking for the stolen assets, you are targeting the wrong family, Patricia declared, her voice suddenly taking on a shrill, authoritative edge. She marched past me, addressing the bank executive and the police officers directly. Bradley is an innocent man. He is a victim of corporate espionage. The lead officer raised an eyebrow, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. Is that right, ma'am? It absolutely is. Patricia insisted, her chest heaving as she adjusted the lapels of her silk robe. She turned and glared at me, her eyes flashing with a toxic, triumphant gleam. You think you have outsmarted us, Gwendolyn? You think you can use your federal connections to destroy my son? But I know exactly who orchestrated this entire fraudulent scheme. It was DeAndre. Monica lifted her head from her hands, stumbling into the foyer. Her tear-streaked face registered fresh horror as her mother openly prepared to throw her husband to the wolves without a second of hesitation. Mom, what are you doing? Monica choked out, leaning heavily against the banister. I am saving this family, Monica. Patricia snapped back, not even bothering to look at her daughter. She turned her attention entirely back to the officers. DeAndre used his tech startup to manipulate Bradley's accounts. He forced my son to launder that money, and I can prove it. Follow me. She gestured for the authorities to follow her down the main hallway. I trailed behind them, keeping my clipboard tucked neatly under my arm, my expression entirely neutral. Patricia led us into Bradley's expansive, mahogany-paneled home office. The room smelled of expensive cigars and polished leather. She marched directly to a large abstract painting hanging behind the heavy oak desk and yanked it off the wall, revealing a state-of-the-art biometric keypad safe embedded deep within the steel-reinforced drywall. This will prove your little hacker friend DeAndre is the mastermind. Patricia gloated, turning to sneer at me. She was so convinced of her own brilliance, so certain she had finally outmaneuvered me and outsmarted the federal government. DeAndre brought a briefcase here 3 nights ago. He demanded Bradley lock it away. He told Bradley it contained the stolen proprietary code and the manipulated fund algorithms. He hid his digital evidence in my house to frame my son. The lead officer stepped forward, shining his heavy tactical flashlight onto the keypad. Open it, please. Patricia stepped up to the panel. She typed in a complex 12-digit numerical sequence and pressed her thumb against the biometric scanner. The heavy steel door engaged with a deep mechanical clank and swung outward smoothly on its reinforced hinges. There, Patricia declared, stepping back and gesturing grandly toward the dark interior. Take it all. Take the evidence. Arrest DeAndre and leave my innocent family alone. The officer reached inside. He did not pull out a sleek briefcase filled with tech documents, flash drives, or proprietary software patents. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He reached in again, extracting 3 more identical portfolios, followed by a heavy stack of bound, watermarked financial ledgers. Patricia frowned, her triumphant posture faltering slightly as the dust settled. What is that? That is not a briefcase. The bank executive stepped up beside the police officer. He took the top ledger, his experienced eyes scanning the embossed gold lettering on the cover. He flipped the heavy book open to the first page, running his finger down a column of printed figures and routing numbers. These are not tech documents, ma'am. The executive stated, his voice completely devoid of sympathy or hesitation. These are comprehensive physical banking records from the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. Patricia's face went absolutely slack. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch of the Thorne family suddenly looked incredibly small and impossibly fragile in the center of the massive office. I stepped forward, moving to the edge of the mahogany desk. I looked directly into Patricia's wide, terrified eyes. The authorities did not need DeAndre's proprietary code, Patricia. I explained, keeping my voice perfectly calm and level. We already have the complete digital audit trail of Bradley's wire transfers. What the federal investigators were missing was the physical paper trail connecting the offshore shell corporations to a primary account holder. The bank executive turned the heavy ledger around, holding it up so the stark fluorescent light of the officer's flashlight illuminated the very bottom of the page. And here it is. The executive confirmed, tapping a specific line of text. There, at the bottom of the offshore account registration, explicitly authorizing the transfer of millions of dollars in untaxed laundered investment capital, was a large, sweeping signature in dark blue ink. It did not belong to DeAndre. It did not even belong to Bradley. It was Patricia's distinctive, unmistakable handwriting. Patricia stared blindly at her own signature. Her breath caught in her throat, producing a sharp, wheezing sound in the quiet room. She looked at the open, empty safe, then slowly turned her head to look back at me. The final devastating realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. DeAndre had not just traded Bradley to the federal investigators to save himself. When he sat across from me in that coffee shop, completely terrified of going to federal prison, he had traded the entire Thorne family. He had handed me the exact location of Patricia's hidden physical ledgers, knowing they were the final nail in her coffin. "You knew?" Patricia whispered, her voice completely stripped of its usual venom, replaced entirely by pure, suffocating dread. "You knew exactly what was in there." I raised my clipboard, making a final decisive checkmark on my audit sheet. "I told you outside the school, Patricia." I replied, my tone carrying absolute, unyielding finality. "I am accusing you of living on stolen time. Your time is officially up." The lead officer sealed the heavy leather-bound ledgers inside thick plastic evidence bags with a sharp, definitive zip. I did not wait to watch the remaining color drain from Patricia's face. I simply turned on my heel and walked back through the cavernous, echoing foyer, stepping out through the grand double doors and into the crisp afternoon air. The scene outside the mansion had descended into absolute unhinged madness. The sprawling gravel driveway was now blocked by 3 separate federal vehicles and a heavy flatbed tow truck. Police officers were systematically impounding the unmarked moving vans Patricia had frantically hired. Monica was standing near Bradley's prized sports car, her hands tangled in her hair, hyperventilating as an officer placed a bright orange seizure sticker across the windshield. DeAndre stood a few yards away, clutching his car keys, his eyes darting toward the street as if calculating his odds of escaping on foot. He had come to the house to secure his own exit strategy, but he had walked right into the middle of the raid. Monica saw him. The sheer terror in her eyes instantly solidified into a blinding, venomous rage. She marched across the crushed gravel, her heels snapping aggressively against the stones, and closed the distance between them. Without a single word of warning, she raised her hand and struck DeAndre across the face. The sharp, violent crack of the slap echoed across the entire property. DeAndre stumbled backward, dropping his keys, his hand flying to his reddened cheek. "You spineless, pathetic coward!" Monica shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. "You sold my brother to the federal government. You traded our entire family to save your fraudulent, worthless startup. We gave you everything, and you stabbed us in the back the absolute second the money ran out." DeAndre dropped his hand from his face, his own fear completely replaced by raw, defensive fury. He stepped toward her, pointing a shaking finger. "Your family lied to me, Monica." DeAndre yelled back, his voice cracking under the strain. "Bradley used my company as a dumping ground for his dirty cash. He set me up to take the fall for his massive Ponzi scheme. The venture capital firm froze my accounts. The SEC was drafting an indictment for investor fraud. I am not going to federal prison for your fake empire. You are all entirely bankrupt." Before Monica could retaliate, the screech of tires interrupted their screaming match. A gray sedan slammed into park behind one of the police cruisers. The driver's side door flew open and Bradley scrambled out onto the pavement. He had just posted bail, utilizing the absolute last remnants of Patricia's legitimate retirement accounts to secure his temporary freedom. He looked completely feral. His designer suit was heavily wrinkled, his tie was missing, and his eyes were wild with desperation. He took in the impounded moving vans, the tow truck backing up to his sports car, and his hysterical sister. Then his gaze snapped toward the front porch. 2 officers were escorting Patricia out of the mansion. She looked small, defeated, and utterly terrified. Directly behind her walked the lead investigator, carrying the clear evidence bags filled with the dark, heavy offshore ledgers. Bradley stopped breathing. His mind processed exactly what those books were. Are those the offshore records? Bradley screamed, sprinting toward the porch before a heavy-set officer stepped directly into his path, forcing him to halt. Mom, tell me you did not keep physical ledgers of the wire transfers. Tell me you did not actually write this down. Patricia trembled, clutching her silk robe tightly around her waist. She could not look her son in the eye. I had to track the legacy, Bradley. She sobbed, her voice a pathetic whimper. I had to make sure our family wealth was protected and accounted for. You signed them! Bradley roared, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of red. He fought against the officer restraining him, spittle flying from his lips. You put your signature on the Cayman Island routing numbers, you stupid, arrogant woman. You just handed the SEC a direct, airtight conspiracy charge. You guaranteed that we are all going to die in a federal penitentiary. I stood silently on the manicured sidewalk, my hands resting loosely in the pockets of my coat. I watched the mighty Thorne family completely cannibalize itself. For a decade, they had wielded their immense wealth like a blunt weapon. They had humiliated me at their lavish dinner parties, mocked my sensible clothes, and told me I was genetically unfit for their high society circles. They believed their money made them untouchable deities. Now completely stripped of their stolen millions, they were nothing but feral creatures fighting over a rotting carcass. They were violently tearing each other to pieces over the exact same money they had used to torment me. The heavy tow truck engaged its winch loudly, dragging Bradley's luxury vehicle onto the metal flatbed. Monica collapsed onto the grass, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. DeAndre was actively begging a police officer to let him call his defense attorney. Patricia was physically shrinking under the weight of her son's relentless screaming verbal assault. Then a vehicle completely out of place in the chaotic crime scene glided smoothly down the quiet suburban street. A sleek, midnight black limousine parted the sea of flashing police cruisers and tow trucks, coming to a silent halt directly in front of me. The rear passenger door swung open. Marcus Vance, the highly publicized CEO of the largest cybersecurity conglomerate in Silicon Valley, stepped out onto the pavement. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, his sharp eyes briefly scanning the hysterical, collapsing Thorne family, before dismissing them entirely. He walked straight toward me, extending his right hand with a bright, confident smile. Gwendolyn, Marcus announced, his deep voice carrying effortlessly over the sound of Bradley's screaming. I am sorry to interrupt your afternoon, but my legal team finalized the paperwork, and I wanted to deliver the news personally. I took his hand, offering a firm professional shake. The board of directors just unanimously approved the full acquisition of your A-Shield software architecture. Marcus stated clearly, turning his head just slightly to ensure every single member of the ruined Thorne family heard the exact figure. $25 million. The funds are currently being cleared into your private accounts. Welcome to the executive team. I gripped Marcus Vance's hand firmly. The warmth of the limousine interior beckoned a stark contrast to the cold reality crashing down on the Thorne family behind me. I did not look back at Bradley as he screamed his mother's name, nor at Patricia as the federal agents guided her toward a cruiser. I stepped into the sleek vehicle, the heavy door closing behind me, and sealing away the last remnants of my old life, cementing the beginning of my new one. Exactly 7 days later, the sky over the city opened up, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour. I sat inside the heated cabin of my new car, parked directly across from the heavy oak doors of the twins' private academy. The heater hummed quietly. My phone rested on the console, displaying a welcome email from the A-Shield board of directors regarding my upcoming executive transition. Everything was finally secure. My assets were protected, my career was soaring, and my children were safe. Then I saw him. A miserable, soaked figure stumbling down the sidewalk, shivering in a cheap, waterlogged windbreaker that looked like it had been pulled from a donation bin. It was Bradley. He had lost the tailored suits, the arrogant smirk, and the meticulously styled hair. He looked hollowed out, a desperate ghost of the man who had spent a decade treating me like an inferior subordinate. His eyes were sunken dark bags bruising the skin beneath them, and his posture was completely broken. He was violating a direct federally mandated restraining order just by stepping foot on this street. I immediately unlocked my door and stepped out into the freezing rain, popping my umbrella open. I intercepted him halfway down the block, making sure his chaotic presence remained far away from the main entrance where the parents were gathering. He flinched when I stepped into his path. His eyes were bloodshot, darting frantically around the wet street. "You are violating a court order, Bradley," I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the heavy rain. "If you do not turn around and walk away right now, I am calling the police, and your bail will be revoked instantly." He dropped to his knees right there on the wet concrete. The puddles soaked instantly through his thin trousers. He clamped his hands together, tilting his head back to look at me, tears mixing with the freezing rain pouring down his face. "Gwen, please." He gasped, his teeth literally chattering. "I just need 5 minutes. They seized everything. My mother's accounts. Monica's trust, the offshore funds. It is all gone. The feds took the house. My court-appointed lawyer said the SEC is pushing for 20 years. 20 years, Gwen, in a federal penitentiary. I will not survive that. Actions have consequences," I replied coldly, feeling absolutely zero pity for the man groveling at my feet. "You built a fraudulent empire you stole from innocent people, and now your house of cards has collapsed." "We built a family together, Gwen." Bradley cried out, his voice cracking with manufactured desperate agony. He reached out his shaking fingers, hovering inches from my coat, too afraid of the restraining order to actually touch me. "You can't let the father of your children go to prison. You have $25 million now. You are an executive. You have the power, the connections. You can hire the best defense team in the country. You can make this go away. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you full custody. Just do not let them take my life away. Think about Leo. Think about Mia. They need their father." He was trying to play his final, most manipulative card, weaponizing my love for my own children to save his miserable skin. He thought he could exploit my maternal instincts just like he had exploited my technical skills and my patience for the last 10 years. Before I could tell him exactly what I thought of his pathetic performance, the heavy oak doors of the academy swung open. The afternoon bell echoed through the rain. Children began pouring out onto the covered portico, their bright raincoats cutting through the gloom. Through the crowd, I spotted Leo and Mia walking side by side, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. Bradley saw them too. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring me completely, and plastered on a frantic artificial smile. He wiped the rain and tears from his face, trying to project the image of a loving parent. He took a step toward the portico, raising his hand high. "Leo, Mia, Daddy is here," Bradley called out, his voice dripping with forced, sickening sweetness. "We're going to go get ice cream." The twins stopped at the edge of the stone steps. They looked at the soaked, desperate man standing in the rain. They did not run toward him. They did not smile. Mia shrank back, her small hands gripping the straps of her backpack tightly, her eyes wide with apprehension. Bradley took another step forward, reaching out for them. "Come give your dad a hug. We are going to fix all of this, I promise." Leo moved. He did not step toward his father. He stepped sideways, placing his body directly in front of his younger sister, shielding her from Bradley's view. My son stood perfectly straight, his expression an absolute chilling mirror of my own resolve. He had endured enough of his father's toxic presence to recognize a lie when he saw one. "You told Grandma we were just dead weight, Dad," Leo stated. His young voice was incredibly calm, piercing through the sound of the falling rain with devastating clarity. "You said we were expensive liabilities holding you back. We heard you." Bradley froze instantly. His outstretched hand dropped to his side. The artificial smile slid completely off his face, replaced by a look of absolute soul-crushing horror. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He realized in a single agonizing second that his lies had not just destroyed his marriage and his freedom. He had completely irrevocably lost the respect of his own children. He was nothing to them but a stranger standing in the rain. I stepped past Bradley, ignoring his existence entirely. I walked up to the portico, placed a protective hand on each of my children's shoulders, and guided them under the shelter of my umbrella. We walked together to my waiting car. I opened the doors, made sure they were buckled in safely, and slid into the driver's seat. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the architect of my former misery standing completely alone, shivering in the torrential downpour as his world finally faded into nothing. The fallout from Bradley's arrest and the brutal seizure of the Thorne estate could not be contained to whispered country club gossip or sealed federal indictments. Within 7 days, the sheer magnitude of the financial fraud had transformed my ex-husband's downfall into a highly lucrative media spectacle. The press smelled blood in the water, and the Thorne family was completely incapable of staying out of the spotlight. I sat behind the expansive glass desk of my new corner office at A-Shield headquarters, sipping black coffee as I watched the high-definition monitor mounted on the wall. Outside my windows, the Silicon Valley skyline stretched out in a display of legitimate corporate success. On the screen, however, my former sister-in-law had decided to go on the offensive. Monica was sitting on the plush beige sofa of a popular daytime talk show. She had entirely abandoned her usual wardrobe of aggressive luxury brands. Instead, she wore a painfully modest, inexpensive pastel cardigan. Her usually flawless blowout was styled to look deliberately messy and unkempt. She was playing the role of the traumatized, oblivious victim, and she was putting every ounce of her energy into the performance. The host, a sharp-eyed veteran journalist named Sarah, leaned forward with a look of practiced, careful sympathy. "I just did not know the extent of it," Monica choked out, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. Bradley and Gwendolyn had this incredibly toxic, combative dynamic behind closed doors. Gwen was always demanding more money, more status, more control. She pushed my brother to the absolute brink to maintain her lifestyle. My mother and I were just collateral damage in their twisted psychological war. I watched her lie through her teeth with absolute fascination. She was using my supposed greed to cover up her own complicity. She desperately wanted the public to see me as the vindictive, gold-digging ex-wife and herself as the innocent bystander who was tragically blindsided by a financial disaster she had no part in creating. Sarah, the host, tilted her head, maintaining her journalistic poise. "But the federal government seized your personal assets as well, Monica. Your trust fund, your vehicles, your bank accounts. The authorities clearly believe you benefited from these crimes." Monica let out a loud, tragic sob, clutching the tissue to her chest. "I have absolutely nothing left because of Gwen's vindictive crusade to destroy my brother," she stated, letting her voice tremble with manufactured despair. "Yesterday, I had to walk into a local diner and ask the manager for a minimum wage application. I have never worked in food service in my life. I am a mother. I am completely terrified of how I am going to feed my children, all because my sister-in-law decided to punish our entire family for her failed marriage." She stared directly into the camera lens, aiming for maximum emotional impact. "I just want my life back. I want to be left alone." The host nodded slowly, looking appropriately grim for the daytime audience. "It is an undeniably devastating situation for you and your mother, Monica. The public backlash has been—" Suddenly, Sarah paused mid-sentence. She pressed 2 fingers firmly against her earpiece. Her expression shifted from sympathetic to razor-sharp in a fraction of a second. The control room was clearly feeding her live breaking information right into her ear. "Monica." "Hold on one moment," Sarah said. Her voice instantly dropped its warm, comforting cadence and adopted a hard, objective edge. "We are receiving breaking news directly from the federal courthouse regarding this exact case." Monica froze. The crumpled tissue hovered inches from her face. The calculated, tragic vulnerability in her eyes was instantly erased, replaced by genuine, creeping panic. She looked at the host, her posture stiffening as the reality of live television suddenly felt like a trap. "Your estranged husband, DeAndre, has just formally entered a plea agreement with the FBI," Sarah announced, reading straight from the teleprompter as the breaking news ticker flashed across the bottom of the screen. "According to the newly unsealed court documents, DeAndre has handed over a massive cache of encrypted corporate communications to federal prosecutors." Monica stopped breathing. The modest pastel cardigan suddenly looked suffocating. "These documents include thousands of direct messages and emails between you and your brother, Bradley." Sarah continued, her eyes locking onto her guest with absolute, unyielding ruthlessness. Furthermore, the FBI spokesperson has confirmed that these communications explicitly contradict the statement you just made on this program. I leaned forward in my leather executive chair, resting my chin on my hands. I did not blink. The documents outline in your own words exactly how you instructed Bradley to structure the offshore accounts to hide the defrauded funds. Sarah stated, her voice echoing through the silent studio. The federal prosecutor states these emails prove you knowingly and actively spent millions in stolen investor capital to fund your personal lifestyle, and that you were fully aware the money was illicit. The camera zoomed in tightly on Monica's face. The remaining color completely drained from her skin, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her mouth opened and closed, but not a single sound came out. She looked wildly around the studio, staring at the cameras, the lighting crew, and the host. She realized there was no escape. She had willingly walked into a live television studio to lie to millions of people, and the federal trap had slammed shut while the red broadcast light was on. Monica dropped her face into her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she broke down into genuine, uncontrollable hysterics right there on the beige sofa. The heavy wooden doors of the federal courtroom remained firmly shut, sealing out the media circus that raged on the courthouse steps. Inside, the air was freezing and entirely sterile. I sat perfectly still on the polished oak witness stand. I wore a tailored slate gray suit, a far cry from the sensible, modest clothes the Thorne family had relentlessly mocked for a decade. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, feeling the heavy, expectant gaze of the 12 jurors lock onto me. Across the room, Bradley sat at the defense table. He looked pathetic. The swaggering, untouchable heir to the Thorne empire had been reduced to a pale, sweating shell of a man. His tailored suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Beside him stood Arthur Sterling, a high-powered defense attorney renowned for shredding witnesses with ruthless theatrical precision. Sterling was currently pacing the floor, adjusting his expensive tie, preparing to perform for the gallery. Sterling stopped pacing and pivoted sharply to face me. He leaned against the wooden railing of the witness box, invading my personal space. "Let us talk about your impressive new career, Gwendolyn," Sterling began, his voice booming with practiced condescension. "You were recently appointed to the executive board of A-Shield, the most formidable cybersecurity firm in Silicon Valley. You are a digital architect, a brilliant software engineer, a woman who understands the intricate hidden webs of the internet better than anyone else in this room. Is that correct?" "I am highly qualified in my field, yes," I answered, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "Highly qualified is an understatement," Sterling sneered, turning his back to me to address the jury directly. "You are a mastermind, and yet for the last 10 years you portrayed yourself as a simple, supportive housewife. But we know the truth about what was happening behind the closed doors of the Thorne estate, do we not?" Sterling marched back to the defense table, snatched up a thick stack of printed logs, and slammed them down onto the railing inches from my hands. "While my client Bradley Thorne was working tirelessly to build a legitimate, thriving investment firm, you were locked in your basement office." Sterling's voice rose, vibrating with manufactured outrage. "You worked 80-hour weeks. You barely slept. You completely neglected your marital duties. You ignored your own children, Leo and Mia, pushing them aside so you could stare at lines of code in the dark." Bradley slumped lower in his chair, attempting to look like the tragic, heartbroken father. The jury watched me closely, waiting for a crack in my composure. I did not give them one. "You were not just doing freelance coding, Gwendolyn," Sterling shouted, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. "You were building a criminal empire. You used your elite hacking skills to siphon millions of dollars from honest investors. You created the Cayman Island routing numbers. You established the shell companies. And then, when the federal authorities started closing in, you meticulously framed your technologically illiterate husband to take the fall. You orchestrated this entire financial massacre to steal his wealth and destroy his life." The courtroom was dead silent. The gallery held its breath. The prosecution objected loudly to the badgering, but I raised my hand, just slightly silencing the prosecuting attorney. I looked directly into Arthur Sterling's eyes. He expected a hysterical, defensive woman. He expected the easily intimidated victim the Thorne family had conditioned for years. Instead, I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that made Sterling visibly falter and take a half-step back. Mr. Sterling, your understanding of cybersecurity is as fraudulent as your client's investment portfolio. I stated clearly, projecting my voice so it reached the furthest corners of the gallery. I did not hack anything. I simply know how to read the digital footprints your client was too arrogant to cover up. I turned to the presiding judge. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to direct the jury's attention to Prosecution Exhibit 402. The judge nodded. A massive screen lowered behind the witness stand, illuminating the dim courtroom with a glaring white light. Rows of complex data timestamps and lengthy numerical codes appeared on the display. Sterling scrambled back to the defense table, his face draining of color as he whispered frantically to Bradley. Bradley was violently shaking his head, his panic breaking through his tragic facade. What you are looking at on this screen are the exact IP addresses and MAC addresses associated with every single illegal wire transfer made to the Cayman Islands. I explained, speaking directly to the jury with the calm, authoritative tone of an executive running a board meeting. Every time money was stolen from an investor, a digital fingerprint was left behind. Mr. Sterling claims I sat in my basement and orchestrated these crimes. However, the data tells a radically different story. I picked up a laser pointer from the stand and aimed a bright red dot at the first highlighted row of data. This specific IP address initiated 22 separate fraudulent transfers over a period of 6 months. I stated, this IP address is registered to the private high-speed Wi-Fi network at the Oak Ridge Country Club, specifically the men-only VIP cigar lounge. A room I have never been permitted to enter, but a room where Bradley Thorne spent every Thursday evening. I moved the laser pointer down to the next highlighted section. This second block of IP addresses authorized the creation of the shell companies used to hide the defrauded capital. I continued, my voice cutting like glass. These transfers were executed using the private secured network of the St. Regis Resort in Aspen. The exact dates of these transfers match a week-long ski trip Bradley took in February. A trip he claimed was for business, but as previous witness testimony has proven, was actually a romantic getaway with his mistress. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Bradley dropped his head into his hands, gripping his hair in absolute terror. Sterling looked completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open. I moved the laser to the final, most damning string of data at the bottom of the screen. Finally, we have the device identifier. The MAC address that physically triggered the final desperate transfer of $15 million just days before the FBI raid. I looked away from the screen and stared directly at Bradley, locking eyes with him as he slowly lifted his head. This MAC address belongs to a custom-ordered platinum-plated smartphone. A phone purchased under Bradley Thorne's personal name, registered to his private cellular account, and recovered from his jacket pocket by federal agents at the time of his arrest. I turned back to Arthur Sterling. The high-priced defense attorney was actively sweating, his theatrical bluster entirely destroyed by undeniable hard-coded evidence. Sir, the IP addresses, funneling the stolen money, perfectly matched the Wi-Fi at Bradley's favorite golf club, the luxury resort he took his mistress to, and his personal physical phone. I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. Unless you are suggesting I somehow followed him to a secluded hotel room with another woman just to secretly use his Wi-Fi. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs, furious whispers, and stifled laughter. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly against the sounding block, shouting for order, but the noise only swelled. Sterling collapsed into his chair, completely defeated. Bradley simply stared at me, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that his arrogance had built his own cage, and I had just locked the door. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open again the following morning, ushering in a distinctly different kind of tension. Bradley Thorne sat at the defense table, his face a mask of gray defeat. Arthur Sterling had completely abandoned his theatrical pacing, opting instead to furiously scribble on legal pads, actively avoiding eye contact with the jury. The prosecution called their star cooperating witness. DeAndre walked down the center aisle. He wore a simple, off-the-rack gray suit, stripped of the flashy designer watches and custom cufflinks he used to flaunt at Thorne family dinners. His shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of his impending testimony. In the second row of the gallery, Monica sat rigid. She wore large, dark sunglasses indoors, an obvious attempt to hide her swollen eyes from the aggressive media pool sketching her every move. Despite the dark lenses, the absolute venom radiating from her posture was palpable. She glared at DeAndre with a toxic, unblinking intensity as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the whole truth. The lead prosecutor approached the podium. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She immediately directed DeAndre to outline the exact infrastructure of Bradley's financial operation. DeAndre leaned into the microphone. His voice shook slightly at first, but stabilized as he began reciting the undeniable facts. He detailed how Bradley had approached him 8 months ago with a proposition. Bradley needed a legitimate-looking technology startup to act as a massive sponge for illicit capital. DeAndre, desperate for venture capital funding and eager to impress his wealthy brother-in-law, agreed to be the CEO on paper. "I set up the server infrastructure," DeAndre confessed, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "Bradley funneled the stolen investor capital through a series of shell companies in the Caymans. I then generated fake invoices for cybersecurity consulting services that never actually happened. We washed $15 million in 6 months, making it look like legitimate corporate revenue." The jury scribbled furiously. Bradley kept his eyes glued to the defense table, his hands trembling. The prosecutor paced in front of the jury box. She held up a clear evidence bag containing a sleek silver hard drive. "And the proprietary software your startup claimed to be selling, the actual code you used to legitimize these massive invoices. Where did that come from?" DeAndre swallowed hard. For the first time since taking the stand, he turned his head and looked directly at me. I sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor, my posture perfect, my expression neutral. "I stole it," DeAndre admitted. The silence in the room deepened, growing heavy and absolute. "I stole the foundational architecture for the A-Shield software directly from Gwendolyn's personal home server." A wave of shocked whispers washed over the gallery. The judge struck his gavel once, demanding quiet. The prosecutor prompted DeAndre to continue. "Why did you steal from your own sister-in-law?" she asked sharply. DeAndre gripped the edges of the witness stand. "Because Bradley told me to. He said Gwendolyn was too weak, too passive, and too busy playing the dutiful housewife to ever realize what she actually possessed. Bradley convinced me her code was just a hobby, a pathetic little side project that would rot on a hard drive. He said she lacked the killer instinct to ever monetize it, so we might as well take it and use it to build our own empire. I copied her directories while attending a Sunday family dinner at their estate. I took her life's work to save my failing company." I held his gaze. I did not glare and I did not show anger. I simply let him look at the woman he had severely underestimated, a woman who now sat on the executive board of a $25 million cybersecurity conglomerate. DeAndre looked away, first deeply ashamed. The prosecution rested its direct examination. Sterling's cross-examination was entirely toothless. He could not attack a witness who had already handed over encrypted hard drives, IP logs, and signed confessions to the FBI. When DeAndre stepped down from the stand, the proceedings moved swiftly into the sentencing phase of his specific plea agreement. The judge, an older man with a severe, unforgiving expression, peered over his glasses at the ruined executive standing before him. "You have cooperated fully with federal authorities," the judge stated, his voice booming through the courtroom speakers. "You provided the exact digital keys required to dismantle this fraudulent network and secure a conviction against the primary architect of this scheme. For that cooperation, and only for that cooperation, I am accepting the prosecution's recommendation. You will not serve time in a federal penitentiary." A collective gasp echoed from the Thorne family supporters in the gallery. Monica practically vibrated with rage in her seat. DeAndre let out a long, ragged exhale, his knees buckling slightly with relief. However, the judge continued, his tone turning to ice. You knowingly participated in a massive criminal conspiracy. You stole intellectual property and facilitated the destruction of honest investors' lives. Therefore, your corporate business licenses are permanently revoked. You are barred from holding any executive position in the financial or technology sectors for the rest of your natural life. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate seizure of all your remaining personal assets to pay massive total restitution to the victims. DeAndre stood frozen. He was a free man, but he had been stripped of everything that defined him. He was completely unequivocally bankrupt. His career was annihilated. His reputation was radioactive dust. The court adjourned for the afternoon recess. I gathered my coat and walked calmly out of the double doors, stepping into the chaotic marble-lined hallway of the courthouse. Reporters swarmed the perimeter, held back by a line of federal marshals. DeAndre emerged a few moments later, walking slowly, staring blankly at the floor. Before he could reach the exit, Monica intercepted him. She shoved her way through a cluster of whispering onlookers, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She ripped her dark sunglasses off, exposing her red, furious eyes. "You pathetic, treacherous rat!" Monica screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You sold out my brother. You sold out our family to save yourself, and you still lost everything. You are a completely worthless failure." DeAndre looked at her, his expression utterly dead. "Your family used me, Monica. Your brother set me up to be the fall guy. We are both bankrupt because of your greed." Monica let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She aggressively grabbed her left hand, violently twisting the massive multi-carat diamond wedding ring off her finger. The metal scraped against her skin, leaving a bright red mark. "I am entirely done with you," Monica shrieked. With a vicious overhand throw, she hurled the heavy diamond ring directly at his chest. The expensive piece of jewelry struck DeAndre's lapel with a sharp thud, before bouncing off and clattering loudly against the polished marble floor. It rolled away, coming to a stop near a heavy wooden bench. DeAndre did not even flinch. He did not bend down to pick it up. He simply stepped around the glittering stone and walked out the glass doors, disappearing into the sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters, leaving Monica standing alone in the hallway, screaming at his retreating back. The days following DeAndre's devastating testimony blurred into a rapid, relentless march toward the inevitable end. The defense rested their case with a pathetic whimper. Arthur Sterling, finally realizing his client was a sinking ship strapped to a digital anvil, barely managed to offer a coherent closing statement. He knew the data was irrefutable. The jury deliberated for exactly 4 hours. Now the heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom remained closed, trapping the stifling nervous energy inside. The air conditioning hummed loudly, but it did absolutely nothing to cool the suffocating tension vibrating through the room. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my posture rigid, my hands folded neatly in my lap. My expression was a mask of absolute unwavering calm. At the defense table, Bradley was actively disintegrating. He was sweating profusely. Large drops of moisture beaded on his forehead and soaked into the collar of his once immaculate dress shirt. He kept wiping his clammy palms on his trousers, his right leg bouncing in a frantic, uncontrollable rhythm against the wooden table. He looked like a cornered animal, completely stripped of the unearned arrogance and aggressive entitlement that had defined his entire existence. 2 rows behind him, the mighty Thorn matriarch was falling apart. Patricia was actively hyperventilating. She clutched a crumpled silk handkerchief against her chest, taking short, ragged, wheezing gasps of air. Her usually pristine makeup was smudged, and her eyes darted wildly around the room, as if searching for a secret emergency exit that did not exist. Monica sat rigidly beside her, staring blankly at the back of her brother's head, completely hollowed out and dead-eyed since DeAndre's departure in the hallway. The bailiff announced a 3-minute warning before the judge and jury were scheduled to return. Arthur Sterling stepped away from the defense table to briefly confer with the lead prosecutor. Bradley seized the momentary lapse in supervision. He stood up on shaking legs, leaning his body heavily against the wooden railing that separated the defense area from the public gallery. He turned his head, his bloodshot, terrified eyes locking onto mine. He looked utterly feral. He leaned in close. His breath smelled of stale coffee, sour sweat, and raw panic. "You ruined my life," Bradley hissed, his voice trembling with a pathetic mixture of venom and absolute terror. I did not flinch. I did not lean away from him. I simply looked at the man who had spent a decade trying to convince me I was a worthless, inferior subordinate. I looked at the man who had tried to build a criminal empire on the back of my stolen labor. "You ruined it the day you made greed your only personality trait," I replied, my voice quiet, steady, and sharp as a scalpel. Bradley opened his mouth to retaliate, but the heavy side door of the courtroom swung open. "All rise!" The bailiff shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Bradley scrambled back into his chair, nearly tripping over his own feet. The presiding judge took his seat at the bench, his expression carved from stone. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defense table with absolute contempt. A moment later, the 12 members of the jury filed into the box. Not a single one of them looked in Bradley's direction. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the jury foreman replied, standing up and passing a folded sheet of paper to the bailiff. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The bailiff handed the paper to the judge, who unfolded it slowly, reading the contents with a blank expression before handing it back. "The defendant will rise," the judge ordered. Bradley tried to stand, but his knees buckled. Arthur Sterling had to physically grip his client's arm and haul him upward, forcing him to remain on his feet. Bradley was openly weeping, now silent tears tracking through the sweat on his face. "On count 1 of the indictment, conspiracy to commit wire fraud. How do you find?" the judge asked. "Guilty," the foreman stated clearly. Bradley let out a sharp, strangled gasp. "On count 2, the embezzlement of corporate funds. How do you find guilty? On count 3, aggravated tax evasion and the unlawful concealment of offshore assets. How do you find guilty?" The foreman continued down the list. "Guilty, guilty, guilty." With every single word, Bradley physically shrank, his shoulders collapsing inward as the reality of his total destruction crushed down upon him. The judge silenced the rising murmurs in the gallery with a sharp crack of his gavel. "Bradley Thorne," the judge began, his voice dripping with judicial disgust, "you have demonstrated a staggering, unprecedented level of greed and arrogance. You orchestrated a massive financial scheme that destroyed the livelihoods of honest investors, and you attempted to shift the blame onto your own family to save yourself. You have shown absolutely zero remorse for your actions, only regret that your fraudulent empire was dismantled." The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "Given the overwhelming severity of your crimes, the substantial financial damages inflicted upon the victims, and your status as an extreme flight risk, I am revoking your bail immediately. Furthermore, I see no reason to delay sentencing. For the counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary to be served consecutively without the possibility of early parole." The gavel slammed down against the sounding block with a loud, definitive crack that sealed Bradley's fate forever. "No!" The scream tore through the courtroom, a visceral, blood-curdling shriek of absolute devastation. Patricia Thorne leaped to her feet, her hands clutching her head. She stared at the federal agents moving in to place handcuffs on her golden child. The reality of losing her wealth, her social standing, and now her son shattered her fragile, manicured reality. She let out a second breathless wail. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and her knees gave way entirely. Patricia collapsed backward, her body crashing hard into the wooden gallery benches before sliding limply onto the floor. The courtroom erupted into absolute unchecked chaos as medical personnel rushed down the aisle, completely ignoring Bradley as he was dragged away in chains. 2 months after the gavel fell on Bradley's sentence, the federal government moved to liquidate the seized Thorne assets. The crown jewel of their fraudulent empire was the estate itself, a sprawling architectural marvel sitting on 4 acres of pristine Silicon Valley real estate. However, due to the rapid nature of the federal asset forfeiture auction, the opening bid was set at a severely undervalued $1.5 million. The auction took place directly on the manicured front lawn of the estate. A crisp autumn breeze swept through the towering oak trees, rustling the leaves, as a crowd of aggressive real estate developers, anonymous investors, and whispering neighbors gathered around the federal auctioneer's podium. I stood near the back of the crowd, wearing a tailored navy trench coat against the morning chill. I held a numbered bidding paddle loosely at my side. I did not mingle. I simply watched the grand wooden double doors of the house I used to inhabit, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating resolve. A sleek black town car pulled halfway up the driveway, ignoring the federal marshal's parking directions. Patricia and Monica stepped out. They were desperately trying to project the image of untouchable old money, but the cracks in their facade were glaringly obvious. Patricia wore a vintage Chanel suit that looked slightly too large on her shrinking frame. Her posture was rigidly defensive. Monica flanked her mother, clutching a designer handbag like a shield, her eyes darting nervously across the crowd. They were here on a mission of desperate pride. Through the network of Silicon Valley gossip, I already knew their strategy. Patricia had spent the last 8 weeks relentlessly begging, leveraging decades-old country club favors, and liquidating her few remaining untainted personal assets to scrape together a private loan. They were completely convinced they could buy back the estate at the absolute minimum bid, effectively erasing the humiliation of the federal seizure and securing the Thorne legacy. Patricia's eyes scanned the crowd and immediately locked onto me. Her jaw tightened. She whispered something to Monica, and the two women marched directly toward my position at the back of the lawn. "Come to watch us reclaim what is rightfully ours," Patricia hissed, stopping inches from me. She tilted her chin up, attempting to look down her nose despite my height advantage. I looked at her calmly. "I am here for the auction, Patricia, just like everyone else." "You have a lot of nerve showing your face on this property," Patricia sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "This estate was built by Thorne money. Bradley designed those marble entryways. He imported those crystal chandeliers from Italy while you sat in the basement playing with computers. You were nothing but a temporary guest in our world. You completely destroyed my son, you locked him in a cage, but you will never take our family home. We secured the funding. We are taking back this house today, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it." Monica chimed in, a nasty smirk, twisting her lips. "You should leave, Gwen. It is actually pathetic watching you stand here hoping to see us fail. We are old money. We always survive. You are just a bitter ex-wife who got lucky with a single software program." I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. "Your son built this house with money he stole from innocent people, Patricia." I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion. "He imported those chandeliers using funds meant for teachers' retirement accounts. There is no Thorne legacy left. There is only a crime scene being liquidated by the Department of Justice." Patricia gasped, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "You vindictive, heartless woman," she spat. Before she could launch into another tirade, the sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel echoed across the lawn through a portable sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin the bidding on the primary estate," the auctioneer announced, adjusting his microphone. "The starting bid is set at $1.5 million. Do I hear 1.5? Patricia instantly spun around and shot her paddle into the air. 1.5. She shouted, her voice shrill with desperate authority. 1.5 million to the lady in the front, the auctioneer confirmed. "Do I hear 1.6? A representative for a commercial developer raised a hand. 1.6. Patricia glared at the man and immediately raised her paddle again. 1.8. The crowd murmured. The developer countered. 2 million. Patricia's hands were shaking, but she refused to back down. Monica stood beside her, furiously typing on her phone, likely updating their private lenders on the escalating situation. Patricia raised her paddle high. 2.2 million. The developer shook his head and lowered his hand, stepping back into the crowd. The price was climbing too fast for a quick flip. A few other investors exchanged glances, but no one else raised a paddle. The sheer aggressive desperation radiating from Patricia seemed to ward off the casual buyers. "We have $2.2 million," the auctioneer called out, scanning the silent crowd. "Do I hear 2.3? Patricia stood tall, a triumphant, arrogant smile spreading across her face. She turned her head slightly, shooting a victorious glare in my direction. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had salvaged the final remnant of her son's fraudulent empire. 2.2 million going once, the auctioneer declared. Monica let out a loud sigh of relief, patting her mother's shoulder. 2.2 million going twice. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, clearing the edge of the crowd. I raised my paddle high into the air. $4.5 million, I stated. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the crisp morning air like a gunshot. The entire crowd whipped their heads around to stare at me. The auctioneer blinked, momentarily stunned by the massive, unprecedented jump in the bidding. "I am sorry, ma'am," the auctioneer stammered into the microphone. "Did you say 4.5 million? "I did," I replied, walking steadily down the center aisle of the lawn, straight toward the podium. I bypassed Patricia and Monica entirely. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless sound. She grabbed Monica's arm, her face completely drained of color. Monica stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. They had exhausted every favor and begged every friend just to secure their $2 million loan. They had absolutely nothing left to counter with. $4.5 million is the current bid, the auctioneer announced, recovering his professional composure. "Do I hear 4.6? Silence. Absolute crushing silence descended upon the lawn. Patricia opened her mouth, but no words came out. She literally could not afford to speak. "Going once," the auctioneer called. "Going twice. Sold to the bidder in the navy coat for $4.5 million. The gavel slammed down. I reached the podium. The auctioneer leaned over. "Ma'am, per the rules of this federal auction, we require immediate proof of funds to secure a bid of this magnitude." I reached into the inner pocket of my trench coat. I pulled out a certified cashier's check officially stamped and verified by the primary holding bank of A Shield Corporation. I placed it face up on the wooden podium. The auctioneer adjusted his glasses, inspecting the document. His eyes widened slightly as he verified the astronomical amount printed on the official bank paper. "The funds are verified," the auctioneer announced into the microphone. I turned slowly to face Patricia and Monica. They were frozen in place, standing on the grass of the estate they had just lost forever. "This house is completely clean now, Patricia," I said, my voice carrying across the silent crowd. "It was bought with legitimate hard-earned money, and the deed will be legally registered under my name alone. You have exactly 10 minutes to get off my property before I have the federal marshals escort you out for trespassing." 30 days after the federal auction on the front lawn, the court-mandated eviction deadline arrived. The morning air was sharp, biting with the promise of early winter as I steered my car through the towering wrought iron gates of the estate. The gates had been left wide open, no longer guarded by the private security firm the Thorns used to employ. I drove slowly up the winding half-mile driveway lined with ancient oaks, listening to the gravel crunch beneath my tires. At the top of the drive, parked haphazardly on the custom-laid brick roundabout, sat a battered yellow moving van. Its rear bumper was rusted, and a large dent marred the passenger side door. The federal government had seized the luxury fleet months ago. The Mercedes, the Range Rovers, the vintage Porsche, all liquidated. This cheap hourly rental was the only vehicle Patricia and Monica could secure with the meager, untainted funds they had left. I put my car in park and watched them through the windshield for a long moment. Patricia and Monica were dragging a large, severely warped cardboard box out the front doors. They had no staff, no butlers, no housekeepers, no hired muscle. Every single employee had abandoned ship the moment the federal indictments dropped, and the payroll accounts were frozen by the Department of Justice. Now, the two women who had spent their entire lives treating manual labor as an infectious disease were forced to pack their own miserable belongings. Patricia wore a faded gray tracksuit, a stark contrast to her usual tailored Chanel. Her hair, usually perfectly blown out, hung in limp, frizzy strands around her pale, exhausted face. Monica was sweating profusely, grunting as she hauled her end of the box across the pristine marble portico. I opened my car door and stepped out into the crisp air. I wore a sharp, tailored ivory coat over a dark turtleneck, my posture relaxed but completely commanding. In my right hand, I held the heavy brass keys to the main house. The property manager had handed them over to me an hour ago, fully executing the transfer of the deed. The estate was legally undeniably mine. The sharp click of my heels against the brick drew their attention. Patricia froze, her fingers slipping from the cardboard. The box hit the ground with a heavy, hollow thud, splitting open at the seam to reveal cheap plastic kitchenware. Monica straightened up, wiping a streak of sweat from her forehead. Her face instantly twisted into a mask of pure, exhausted malice. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and endless legal terrors, but her toxic entitlement remained completely intact. "You planned this from the very beginning," Monica spat. Her voice cracked raw and hoarse, echoing against the tall pillars of the portico. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You sat in that basement for years, playing the quiet little mouse, gathering your data, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy us. You set Bradley up, you ruined DeAndre, and you orchestrated this entire eviction just to humiliate us." I stopped at the base of the wide stone steps. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply looked at the two women who had made my existence a living hell for over a decade. I looked at the mother-in-law who had constantly criticized my parenting, my clothes, and my background. I looked at the sister-in-law who had mocked my late nights coding, calling my work a pathetic hobby, while she actively spent the stolen money my husband funneled into her accounts. I let a slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of petty revenge. It was the smile of absolute, untethered peace. "You told me in the courtroom that by signing the divorce papers I was walking away with nothing," I stated. My voice was smooth, cutting through the morning air with absolute precision. "But I walked away with the only things that mattered: my kids, my intellect, and my dignity. You kept the garbage, and now the garbage has taken you out." Patricia let out a sharp, strangled gasp, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth. She looked entirely broken, a hollow shell of the terrifying matriarch she once pretended to be. Monica opened her mouth to scream another insult, but no sound came out. The sheer undeniable reality of their situation had finally crushed the last ounce of fight out of them. They had absolutely zero leverage, zero money, and zero power. I walked gracefully up the stone steps, passing right between them. Neither woman dared to move. I reached the massive custom-built double doors of the estate. I slid the heavy brass key into the lock. I turned it slowly, allowing the heavy, satisfying click of the mechanism to echo across the portico. I pushed the doors open, revealing the grand sweeping foyer that I had just bought back in cash with clean money. I turned back to face them. I stood in the doorway of my home, looking down at the Thorn women shivering on the steps. "You have exactly 3 minutes to get off my property," I commanded. Panic finally overtook Patricia's pride. She grabbed Monica's arm, pulling her roughly toward the rusted rental van. They abandoned the broken box of plastic kitchenware on the marble, scurrying away like frightened animals. They scrambled into the cab of the truck, slamming the heavy metal doors shut. The engine sputtered, choked violently, and finally roared to life, spewing a thick, dark cloud of exhaust into the clean morning air. I stood motionless on the steps, the heavy oak doors open behind me, and watched the yellow van rattle down the long, winding driveway. I watched until it passed through the wrought iron gates and disappeared onto the main road, taking the last remnants of the Thorn family legacy with it. The silence that followed was beautiful. The estate was entirely empty. The toxic presence that had poisoned these walls for years was permanently excised. I stepped inside the grand foyer. I could see the hallway that led to the basement, where I had spent thousands of hours writing the code that ultimately saved me. I could see the grand staircase where I had walked down countless times, feeling invisible and small. That version of me was gone. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air. I had reclaimed my life, my freedom, and my home. I closed the heavy doors behind me, finally locking the past away forever. The rusted yellow moving van rattled down the interstate, carrying the last remnants of the Thorne family away from Silicon Valley and straight into a harsh, unforgiving reality. Their final destination was a cramped, noisy two-bedroom apartment situated directly next to an elevated train track in a forgotten industrial suburb. The roar of the commuter rail shook the thin walls every 15 minutes, rattling the cheap plastic kitchenware they had hastily packed into a split cardboard box. Inside the dim, poorly ventilated living room, Patricia Thorne sat frozen in a faux leather armchair that smelled faintly of stale smoke. She stared blankly at the peeling wallpaper. There were no charity galas to plan, no country club luncheons to attend, and no servants to order around. Her manicured, carefully curated world had shrunk to a pathetic 600 square feet. She clutched a lukewarm mug of instant coffee, trapped completely in a prison of her own making, stripped of the unearned wealth and social superiority that had entirely defined her existence. In the tiny adjacent bathroom, Monica aggressively scrubbed a stain from her polyester blouse. The crushing irony of her new life was an absolute masterpiece of karmic justice. Monica, who had spent years mocking my late nights, coding and sneering at the tech industry, was now a front desk receptionist for a mid-tier software startup. Every morning she had to force a bright, subservient smile for young software engineers she secretly despised. She answered phones, scheduled lunch deliveries, fetched artisan coffee, and endured the casual dismissal of wealthy executives who looked right through her. She was finally experiencing the exact invisibility she had forced upon me for over a decade. Meanwhile, the architects of the Thorne Empire were facing their own respective consequences. Bradley sat on a thin, rigid cot in a federal penitentiary, staring blankly at the cold concrete blocks of his cell. His tailored, imported designer suits had been permanently replaced by a scratchy, ill-fitting khaki jumpsuit. There was no corner office, no offshore accounts to manipulate, and no family members left to blame for his catastrophic failures. He was a man utterly devoid of substance, facing 10 long years of consecutive isolation without the slightest possibility of early parole. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of superiority and the theft of my intellectual property. Without my stolen labor to prop him up, he was nothing but an inmate with a number completely powerless and entirely forgotten. DeAndre had chosen a vastly different path. Half a continent away in Denver, he unlocked the door to a tiny, windowless leased office. It was a far cry from the glass and steel towers of the Thorne Enterprise, but the air inside was completely clean. He booted up a second-hand laptop and poured a cup of cheap drip coffee. By turning state's witness and handing over the unencrypted servers to the prosecution, DeAndre had narrowly avoided prison time, but the massive financial penalties and restitution had left him completely broke. Yet as he sat down to draft a new business proposal, there was a distinct lightness to his posture. He was starting over from absolute scratch, but this time he was building an ethical foundation. He had chosen accountability over greed, trading his fraudulent wealth for a clear conscience and a second chance at an honest life. Back in Silicon Valley, the heavy oak doors of the estate were thrown wide open, allowing the crisp, unpolluted autumn breeze to sweep through the grand foyer. I walked slowly across the imported marble floors, my heels clicking in a steady, victorious rhythm. I moved from room to room, letting the absolute beautiful silence wash over me. For 7 years, this house had been a psychological battleground. It was a place where my ideas were stolen, my confidence was actively undermined, and my sanity was systematically challenged. I paused in the center of the formal dining room, running my hand along the edge of the mahogany table, where Patricia used to hurl her thinly veiled insults. I reflected on those 7 years of relentless emotional abuse. The Thornes had tried everything to make me feel small, disposable, and intellectually inferior. But they completely misunderstood the nature of the woman they were tormenting. Every insult Patricia hissed at me, every lie Bradley spun to keep me compliant, and every condescending smirk Monica offered had not broken me. Instead, their cruelty had acted as a whetstone. Every slight had only sharpened my mind, hardening my resolve and focusing my intellect for the ultimate battle. They thought they were burying me under the weight of their entitlement, but they were actually applying the exact pressure needed to forge a diamond. They handed me the tools of their own destruction, one arrogant mistake at a time. I stepped through the French doors and walked out onto the expansive rear patio. The afternoon sun bathed the property in a warm, golden light. The massive swimming pool sparkled, and the sprawling lawns were completely free of the toxic shadows that had haunted them for so long. At the far end of the property, near the edge of the manicured tree line, I had instructed the landscapers to tear up the useless ornamental rose bushes Patricia had obsessed over. In their place, I had built something real, something that nurtured life instead of draining it. I walked down the stone pathway toward the newly constructed garden beds. Leo and Mia were there laughing loudly as they navigated the rows of rich, dark soil. Leo was holding a woven basket, pointing excitedly as Mia carefully plucked a massive, perfectly ripe red tomato from the vine. Their hands were covered in dirt, their faces glowing with pure, unburdened joy. There was no tension in the air, no hushed arguments behind closed doors, and no fear of setting off a temperamental patriarch. They were completely safe. I stopped a few feet away, leaning against the wooden frame of a trellis, simply watching my children thrive in the home they deserved. My phone buzzed sharply in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was an automated alert from the financial exchange. A-Shield Corporation's stock had just surged past all market expectations, officially hitting an unprecedented all-time high. The cybersecurity software I had built from scratch, the very program Bradley had tried to steal and claim as his own, was now an untouchable industry-leading juggernaut. My financial independence was absolute and permanently secured. I stared at the numbers on the screen for a brief second, then I smiled. I locked the screen, plunging the phone into darkness, and slipped it back into my pocket. I did not care about the money anymore. The billions of dollars were just a byproduct of my survival. I looked back up at Leo and Mia as they ran toward me, holding up their harvest with triumphant, shining grins. The ultimate victory was never just about outsmarting Bradley in a courtroom or bankrupting Patricia at a federal auction. It was never truly about the revenge. It was about reclaiming my peace. I stepped off the stone path and walked forward into the bright, warm sun. The most profound lesson from Gwen's journey is that true victory lies not in vengeance, but in reclaiming your peace. For years, she endured relentless emotional abuse from a family that sought to diminish her worth. However, instead of letting their cruelty break her, she allowed it to sharpen her intellect and forge her unbreakable resilience. When the toxic Thorn Empire inevitably collapsed under its own greed, Gwen walked away whole, surrounded by the genuine love of her children. The ultimate triumph is always living a life defined by your own integrity. Have you ever had to reclaim your peace from a toxic environment? Share your story and comment below.